July 19th, 2011 to order. Will you please rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance? Thank you. Please call the roll. I know they should be here. There they come.
Councilmember Francisco, Hotchkiss,
Here.
House, Rouse,
Here.
Self, White, Mayor Schneider.
Here. Mr. Armstrong, any changes to the agenda? Okay. I'd actually like to bring something up at this point. It's not on the agenda, so we can't really discuss in detail about it, but it relates to a potential change to the agenda from last week. Many of you have watched, and up here, you know, we had quite a discussion about the reduction of single-use bags, and 2 days later, after last week's discussion, the California Supreme Court ruled on the Manhattan Beach ban ordinance, claiming that it was allowable for cities to conduct those kind of ordinances in that way. It was being challenged, and I think had we had that information prior to, we might have had a different discussion. So being on the prevailing side of the vote that gave direction to the Ordinance Committee on that item, I would like to ask my colleagues, we can't get into discussion today about it, but whether we could reconsider it for a future council agenda item. So as we've done on another item earlier this year, this was the time when we had that vote. So I'm going to bring that up here, and so the idea would be to ask to reconsider the direction to the Ordinance Committee as it relates to single-use bags, and to put that on a future council agenda. And I don't know if there's any, I can make a motion to do so. I guess I'll make a motion to do that, and if there's a second, if we have a vote to do that. Mr. Wiley, would that be the correct method? Mr. House, did you just hear what I was?
I would second that, Madam Mayor.
Okay. So it would just be for reconsideration, and so any discussion on that?
Madam Mayor,
Yes, Mr. Francisco.
I think we fully considered the issue at our last meeting.
Okay. Okay. So the motion is to reconsider it for a future agenda item given the new information that we got last week. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay. So I think that failed 4-3. Is that correct? Okay. Thought I'd try, but that's all right. Thank you. Public comment. We have a couple of items here. Ann Victoria Newbling will be followed by Crucito Cruz. And there's 2 minutes up here at the podium. If you'd like to come on up, Ms. Newbling? Is she here? Oh, come on up. And you have 2 minutes up here at the podium.
Okay, I get a little nervous about microphone.
That's okay.
I'm endorsing IFL.
Well, please come up. Before you get started, please come on up.
All right.
There you go.
I appreciate your hard work.
Thank you.
You're my office, just so you know. I want to close the skateboard park. So I'm physically disabled. I'm going to start calling that Baja Fresh. I'm tired of listening to physical descriptions. I'm going to be working at Cottage Hospital Emergency. I'm a designer. I'm an LAX designer. And I'm real unhappy with being smacked around by these you-know-whats on bicycles and skateboards. And I think we need to close the skateboard park. I do work with the fire department and the sheriff's department. I'm working for Obama. I'm a fire marshal. I'm on disability. I intend to get off in February. So that's all I want to say. I appreciate your help.
Okay, thank you. Crucito Cruz will be the final public speaker.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, Helene Schneider, and City Council members. My name is Crucito Herrera Cruz, and I'm here officially to solicit the Santa Barbara City Council, City Clerk's Office, to be nominated as a constituent and as a resident all my life in the City of Santa Barbara as an electorate that wants political power and political access. Why political power and political access is important for our communities is that if we implement models, for instance, district elections, we would have civic transparency and political accountability for respective communities so they could have a decision maker, they could have an elected official, go with their concerns, their ideas to implement policies, grievances, liberties, freedoms, to be associated with any particular resident. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to hold this public comment to officially my press release, people. Thank you very much. I am officially in the ballot. At 8 in the morning, I was there. And hopefully I'll be the first one to submit my 200 names before to show my tenacity. And I won't be the last this time. And I greatly appreciate the time. Hola, para las personas en la comunidad que hablan español, muchas gracias por estando aquí. Me llamo Crucito Herrera Cruz. Yo quiero nombrar mi nombre para elegir esta campaña electoral para la ciudad de Santa Bárbara. Es muy importante a capturar el poder político y la representación accesible para la gente no representada en este political dais, que es el concilio. Entonces, la representación, mi confianza a seguir adelante para el acceso político para la comunidad que no está representada aquí es muy importante. So I was just saying it's more important to be involved in democracy and get involved. Please vote for Crucito Herrera Cruz. Muchas gracias, que sí se puede.
Okay, that concludes public comment. We'll move on to the consent calendar. You have some items to read there.
Item number 4, records destruction for Finance Department. Recommendation that council adopt by reading of title only a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara relating to the destruction of records held by the Finance Department in the Administration, Accounting, General Services, Risk Management, and Treasury Divisions.
Okay, without further objection, we'll waive further reading. Anyone need to take anything off the consent calendar, or is there a motion to approve it?
I move consent.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, report from the Finance Committee, Mr. Francisco.
Yes, Madam Mayor. Today, the Finance Committee heard the quarterly investment report and recommend to the Council that it be accepted.
Which we just did, I think, right? Yes. Thank you. On to a report from the Ordinance Committee, Mr. House.
Yes, thank you. Ordinance Committee met today. We considered changes to, recommended changes to Municipal Code Title 17, Chapter 36, and these are amendments that are pertaining to the harbor parking, and we concurred with staff's recommendations and are sending this on to City Council for approval.
Okay. Item number 7.
Item number 7, reserve policies.
Thank you. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Bob Samario, Finance Director. We're here to talk about reserves and reserve policies. And just a little background as to why we're here, the purpose of this report, essentially. As you may or may not remember, we presented to the Finance Committee back in May a report in connection with the recommended 2012 budget, which included our reserve policies and our reserve balances, at least as they were as of June 30, 2010. We measure them at the end of each fiscal year. So we'll be shortly reviewing the numbers for the current fiscal year that just ended June 30, 11. In that meeting, there was a fair amount of discussion, and in the end, the Finance Committee had suggested some changes to improve the policies as they see them. And so they recommended that the policies be presented to the full council for discussion and direction to the Finance Committee and staff. So for developing more comprehensive enhancements to the policies. And then the plan would be that once the staff and Finance Committee worked through it, we would present back to council, again, a comprehensive policy document with all those changes based on direction from council. Just kind of to get us oriented, we're not intending to make final decisions today. We're really just wanting to get some direction from council, conceptually and otherwise, that we would then take back to the Finance Committee. So we're not looking for final decisions about what the policy would look like. It was, again, just direction we would take back and come up with then a proposed document based on that direction. I'm going to go through the actual resolution number 95-157, which governs the reserve policies. And they are applicable to all of our operating funds. So the general fund, it applies to it, and as well as our enterprise funds. It does not apply, however, to our internal service funds. For example, our special revenue funds, such as the RDA or our Creeks funds. Although we do have reserves, as you know, in some of our internal service funds, primarily for capital replacement purposes and capital improvements. The first of the reserve requirements is a reserve for capital, and it's intended to fund major capital costs. In the general fund, it's a fixed amount because in the general fund, as you know, our capital program was much less than it is in enterprise funds, and the amount is $1 million. It's not variable, it's just fixed. In the enterprise funds, however, it's either 5% of their net book value, so the cost minus depreciation that's been accumulated, or what we actually use on the ground is an average of the previous 5 years of capital funding from their operating fund. So it would not include in this average any monies funded through grants from the federal or state government. It's just what they're funding out of their operating revenues. The second pot of money is a reserve for emergencies or disasters. It's equal to 15% of the annually adopted operating budget, so it's a variable number, and it's intended to provide funds in cases of emergencies such as natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, things that we're susceptible to here. And we would see impacts, including the loss of revenue streams, sales tax, bed tax, if we had a real major disaster. And then, of course, we would have costs to respond to the emergency. So it would be an extraordinary time, extra costs and reduction of revenue streams. The reserve would then provide some funds before FEMA or CalEMA would step in with the disaster relief funds. There would be a period of time. Some funds would receive fairly immediately, but the longer-term cost reimbursements would probably take 1 to 2 years. And then they would also be available to cover any ineligible costs that FEMA, CalEMA don't cover, as well as any uninsured portions of those losses. And then lastly, the reserve for future years' budgets equal to 10% of the annually adopted budget. It's intended to provide, and I'm going to quote here, for unique one-time costs and for the maintenance of city services and permit orderly budget adjustments during periods of reductions. And you saw this, or we saw this in the mid or early 2000s. We had the initial recession of 2001 and 2, and we actually had planned to use some reserves so that we can sort of adjust to the reducing revenues and reduction in the operating budgets of the general fund. And so we intentionally used some of these reserves for a soft landing approach. The policy also suggests that any of these reserves that are used should be accompanied by a plan for replenishment within a reasonable period of time. And then just lastly, when combined with the disaster reserve, it would provide about 3 months or 25% of the operating costs if necessary. And that was actually part of the discussion that went into the development of these policies, that how many months of costs, operating costs, should we be looking to cover? And they eventually landed on 3 months, and that's where the 25% came from, even though they broke it out into 2 different pots. It's all available essentially for a disaster. And then one item that's also included in the resolution that we don't talk much about, but it includes an amount for appropriated reserves. And this applies to all of our operating funds, again, the general fund and enterprise funds. It's supposed to be equal to 0.5% of the operating budget. So if we look at the general fund, its budget is roughly $100 million. We should be having somewhere around $500,000 in an appropriated reserve. We did that for a while, but over the last several years, because it was really never used, it just ended up falling to the reserves at the end of the year. We lowered it to $150,000. So technically, we're not complying with the reserve policies, but I think in practice, it made more sense to lower that to a smaller number. With the enterprise funds, however, they are pretty good about putting aside 0.5% of their operating budget in an appropriated reserve.
Can I stop you there? I mean, the last couple of budget cycles, we did have appropriated reserves. I mean, it was much, much more than 150,000. So
Sure.
we called it appropriated reserves. It was 750,000 one year, and I think 400 the next. So
Madam Mayor,
what's the difference?
That's a good point. There is really no difference in substance. We have established that we need a minimum 150. The other reserves we created in this account, or appropriated reserves, were for the police overhiring, and then we at one point established in this past year a contingency. We actually had some leftover money believe it, after all the balancing, we had some extra revenues that we just put into the appropriated reserve as a contingency. But that was to me, a different purpose than just establishing an appropriated reserve to address things that come up during the year that you need some monies for. But you're right, it's been much larger than that. But like for next year, we're establishing that at 150 plus just a small amount to cover the overhiring for the police department.
Okay, maybe it's the terminology we need to clarify as we move forward, though. Thank you.
This is a chart that you've seen before. It starts with 2004 all the way to 2010. The reserves that we actually have are represented by the bars, and the 3 sections of the bar represent the capital reserve at the bottom in blue. That's the fixed amount of $1 million. The green represents the disaster reserve, at 15%, and then the budgetary reserve and any excess we might have is in the yellow portion. You can see in 2004 we had a total of $27.5 million, which represented about a $4.7 million surplus above what our policy called for. The red line represents what the policy says we should have, and it's a number that trends up because it's a percentage of our operating budget, and as that grows, so do the reserve requirements. And you can see that it actually went down starting in 2009 and because of the fact that we were reducing our budget, we were shrinking our organization, and so the reserve requirements commensurately went down. You can also see in that time period as the reserve requirements were steadily going up, the actual reserves fell from $27.5 million to $18.2 million as of the end of last year, 2010, I mean. So again, just some starting points for discussion. And then I'll just kind of leave it open for the council. But, you know, there have been a lot of questions in the past over the last, since I've been here 15 years, what should the reserve policies be? What do other agencies do? Is there sort of a definitive approach or percentage? And the answer is there is none. There have been surveys that we've done through a listserv, through our own other finance officers in other cities in the state. Rating agencies have done the same. And they all come back with the answer that there's one size does not fit all. It really depends on your community. And some things you would want to consider that I think are appropriate to consider at least are how susceptible are you to revenue or economic swings. A community that is basically receiving property taxes but doesn't have a lot of volatility, is in tourist-based, you know, a bedroom community, you would think that they would probably need less of reserves than a city such as ours because they're not as subject to the economic impacts as we are. We live and die by those revenues, bed taxes, sales taxes, and the like. So I would think that we as a city would probably want to have a little more reserves than a bedroom community, for example. The size of the operating budget, I think, is important. A city like L.A., I can't imagine them having 25% money set aside in their reserve because that's a lot of money that there would be a lot of pressure for that money to be spent for other purposes. So I would suspect that 25% for them is a lot. And then also how susceptible is a community to natural disasters. Obviously we are. Some cities much less than ours. So that also should factor in. So again, no one size fits all, but these are things that you can consider at least as to what is appropriate level. And then currently, as you know, any use of reserves currently does require approval by council, simple majority. Anytime we come to council to use reserves for an additional appropriation, we come to council, and you have to approve that on a majority basis. And then one other thing also is just that the policy currently does not require a plan for replenishing or restoring reserves that it may be used as they were the last several years. It only suggests that. Another discussion point perhaps is the general fund capital reserve, and we've talked about this before, that $1 million has never been used in the last 16 years since it was created, or however many years it's been. Also, as you know, the reserves are established as a percentage of the operating budget with no limits. So essentially, as our budget continues to grow, and will grow over time, as you know, because just costs go up, then our reserve requirements will go up commensurately at 25% of the total. So there is no limit or cap. Another point, I think, is that the general fund currently does not get credit for reserves and other funds, and this is something that's escaped a lot of the discussions, and at least in our opinion, that over the last several years, while we've seen a diminishment in reserves in our general fund for the budgetary purposes, we have at the same time been growing reserves in other funds. Our vehicle replacement fund, for example, and even reserves in our self-insurance fund have grown pretty dramatically, and I would say at least offsetting the amounts that we've seen decline in the general fund. And there's been at least no formal or official credit for that, or recognition of that, if you will. So I think it's maybe an important point for discussion. And then as part of the adopted budget, as you know, the use of reserves does not require separate action. So if an adopted budget contains the use of reserves, and whether it's general fund or any other fund, it's not separate. It's just part of the overall resolutions that get adopted by council. So that's really what I have, and then I'm just going to turn it over to council and to provide some direction. At least these are some things we can talk about if you like, and of course there could be others that you have.
Thank you. We don't have any speaker slips I don't see on here. Okay. I'm going to start with members of the Finance Committee, perhaps, and if you're interested in elaborating on this since you had the discussion first. Mr. Francisco?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I believe that when the City Council back in 1995 established the original reserve policy, that was a move in the right direction. And I think that though the idea of setting up the reserve, the disaster reserve of 15% of the operating budget, and the fiscal emergency reserve, if you will, of 10%, those are both good targets. But there was never really any policy laid out about how those reserves might be used, when they might be used, under what conditions. I think that part was taken for granted, and it was just assumed. And obviously, we can't control what a future council does, but I think what we can do is spend some time to provide some guidelines for the use of reserve funds. A lot of people come to City Council without budgetary backgrounds, and most of them come without experience in municipal government budgeting. So I believe that it would be a worthwhile use of the Finance Committee's time and later the full Council to think about things such as, particularly, we all know what a disaster is. If we have a major earthquake, we'll know that it's okay to use the disaster fund. But what about the fiscal reserve? What economic conditions dictate that we should be dipping into reserves to balance the budget? How much should we dip in? There's the provision within the existing 1995 resolution. There's the suggestion that we should come up with a plan for replenishment. I think we should have a general policy that says when the fiscal reserve, or the emergency reserve for that matter, are below a certain level, we would replenish those reserves in some formula based on the health of city revenues and the general economy. It's a complicated issue. I hope that we can find examples in other municipalities of these kinds of formulas, if you will, that we can look at for comparison. But I think that it would be a step forward for us to establish guidelines about when reserves should be used and when they should be replenished as it'll be helpful both for us and for future councils.
Thank you, Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I appreciate Mr. Francisco's sort of prelude and framing of the concerns that we've discussed at the Finance Committee. Could you, Mr. Samario, put the chart of as the reserves have gone down, that one right there? That really was one that was presented to me, 3 years ago when I started contemplating running for council, and it really does speak to the problem. 2005, 6, 7 were good years, and 2008 was even a good year, and yet we see the reserves going down, and that's what I'm hoping we can get at with this discussion. And I know that one of the things that we do on land use activities is we make findings. We make findings in order for a special action to occur. And so that may be something that sort of mechanism may be something that at least puts council on record going forward. Okay, we're going into the piggy bank here, and we're doing it for these reasons. And at least it kind of frames it for the community, and it makes it sort of puts it on the record. And I also appreciate, you can't just sort of bind people's hands, future people's hands that much. But I do think we can set a tone. And that finding mechanism is one that I ask that we consider going forward. The replenishing, another analogy I'd like to make is to the long-term water supply plan, where we heard Ms. Bjork a few weeks ago speak to. Today is the first day of a possible 6-year drought. And it's sort of just, we were able to get an additional year of water supply reassured by kind of framing our water supply in that context and then planning accordingly. So I feel that way about money as well, and that we need to be on guard. I mean, Mr. Francisco has spoken about a double dip and everybody, of course, it's in back of everybody's minds as the world economy struggles, where these reserves certainly could have helped us keep a library open for a paltry amount of money on Mondays, and that would then be educating our kids and so forth and so on. So I think it was an opportunity missed, and I would like to help this city prepare for the next round of good times when we were able to re-augment the reserves, and bad times when they would be used more wisely than they were this round. So I do look forward to, I hope our council will give us that encouragement to come back to you with some thoughts in that direction.
Ms. Self?
Thank you. I agree with Councilmember Francisco and White, and it's been pointed out up here before that because the money was spent in the good times, we had very little to sustain us through the bad times. And I recognize we can't handcuff anybody, but I think putting forth guidelines of direction and what we intend these funds to be used for, and I would like to see, as strong as we could, something linked to a payback plan. How are we going to do that? And so look forward to the discussion.
Mr. House?
Mr. Samario, the chart that you're showing us up there, it appears to me it's missing something. I just want to say that it doesn't have the years prior to that where the city took a major hit right after 9/11 and the dot-com bust and a whole bunch of things that happened. I remember when I came on council in 2005 in the CAFR and in the discussions you had with us on budget, and you were rather diligent with us, and I mean really determined with us on how we were to be very judicious with the use of the funds and using reserves very carefully. And more than that, you kept showing us each time a payback plan that would stretch out over a number of years and how incrementally we'd be able to put the money back in. And if by embedding in policy we're talking about something like what you were doing for the council during those years, I think I can see it. But I don't know that it would change your practices very much. You want to just talk to us a little bit about that? I mean, it seems like wherever we've actually talked about the reserves and the budget and its as we've come forward, you've been pretty clear with the council about the need to replenish as we with whatever was done, and how carefully and cautiously we should be using the reserves, the limited reserves that we have.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, I think it's fair to say that every year, at least since I've been here, and I'm sure before that, we would come to council or in finance committee or both and talk about what our reserve balances are, but we'd also be presenting, we would present to you each year a multi-year forecast of how things are looking in the future. And, you know, it's always hard to project 2, 3, 4 years out, particularly before any kind of recession might hit. But we would always provide to council our analysis, our projections of where reserves might be if we take certain actions or we don't take certain actions, or based on certain assumptions of revenue growth and expenditure growth. So I think it's fair to say, though, that this past decade has been fairly unusual, very, very volatile. We've had 2 major recessions. We've had PERS rates really going up starting in 2004 and 5, because you may recall when they took the big hits, PERS, back in 2001 and 2, just like they did in 9, they adjusted their rates and implemented new smoothing techniques, unfortunately establishing the rates at a high level. So they picked the highest point that they ever were historically and left them there, implemented smoothing techniques that would take a long time, even in good times, for those rates to go down. And then we're faced with another recession. But I think it's fair to say that we've always been very open about what the reserves have been and about what they're looking like in the future. And I think, I think that's appropriate and an accurate statement.
Yeah, and I think that where I'm going with this is just we would want to embody in policy, if we felt we needed to, the good practices that have been in place from your office and with your predecessor as well. I mean, actually, the ongoing monitoring and the forecasting and giving the best possible information you can to council for making good decisions. And I think that that could be helpful. It certainly is what you've been known for in your office for all this time. And I think that I just feel that it's important to note that had we not had the reserves when the city was hit with the what's, again, not on that chart right there, we would have been in quite a spot. And we would not have wanted to go into disaster reserves. Fortunately, we had that buffer, and with Mr. Armstrong's guidance, and we were able to weather that storm. If we look forward with what you have now, if you were to forecast, and you will be, giving us those forecasts, I suppose what you would be doing would be the kind of thing that I'm hearing the Finance Committee suggesting that we put into policy. The idea that you would actually be using those best practices of your office to give us the best information you possibly could so we can make good decisions here.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Howell, I think that's a fair statement. Clearly, for us to restore the reserves, we're going to have to make a conscious effort and decision to say we're going to put aside some of the monies that we generate each year and put them into making sure that they fall into our reserves. It's going to be challenging over the next few years because we're dealing still with a structural deficit, and that's our first priority. But once we get over this next few years, I think maybe then we'll be in a position to start saying, we're going to dedicate 10% of our revenues, for example, or 5% or 2%, whatever the number is, and make sure that those numbers or amounts get into our reserves so we can start restoring them. Again, if we have, I think, more pressing issues in the next few years, but we're going to, of course, we're not going to come to you and ask and propose any use of reserves over the next few years as we develop recommended budgets. So, at least we're not getting any worse, and hopefully with revenue growth beyond our projections, we can start adding to that. But it's going to take a conscious effort on council's part for us to dedicate some revenues for us to meaningfully start restoring those reserves.
Okay, and then my last thing is for Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong, when we prioritize use of the public's resource, I know that right now probably our biggest priority is to actually shift the balance at a structural level. To ensure that we're actually staying in the positive on an ongoing basis and don't feel the need to even go close to those reserves. And that would be the first priority, if I understand it, prior to making any substantial recovery in terms of the amount of reserves that we have had as policy. Am I understanding the basic approach?
Yeah, and to kind of put it in context, the way we built these reserves up, and it really started probably in the mid-'90s when the economy was roaring, and we made assumptions, especially on the revenue side. We were probably fairly conservative. We'd say, growth will be at 7 or 8%, and guess what? It came in at 9 or 10%. And because of conservative budgeting practices, we then would pick up a couple $1 million, in some cases $3-4 million a year because of that. And then when we hit first the recession right after 9/11, in order to avoid cutting the budget, we got much more precise in our budgeting. We didn't think we could assume revenues were going to be conservative because we were cutting the organization, and we've continued to do that where we haven't been conservative because we didn't want to cut the organization and then have the council go, you ended up $2 million to the good. Why did we have to cut so much? And that's kind of the mode we're in now. I think the other thing that happened probably in the period you see here is we would make assumptions about labor contracts, and then we would grant labor contracts in excess of what we had assumed, and that would happen mid-year, and we'd come to the council and we would say appropriate, from reserves to cover the balance of this for the year. And at that point, we didn't have, as what's been suggested today, that it's okay to do that, but then we would need a plan to restore those reserves and say exactly how we're going to do it. We would just say appropriate $500,000 or $800,000 from reserves to cover the difference between what we had assumed in the budget and what we actually achieved.
Like a one-time solution for an ongoing problem.
I think our challenge is going to be that as we go forward, that as we have a plan to restore the reserves, do we say let's budget $1 million to replenish reserves, even if that means cutting the organization? And that's going to be the challenge for all of us, is do we do that? The other way is to be probably more conservative in our assumptions and take out, don't cut it quite so finely so that when we have a surplus, it will drop to the bottom line. And that's really what we've done. As you look here, where the reserves actually slightly gone up during the middle of a recession, is we pretty much said, no, we're not going to take the risk. And in 2008, or in 2009, when the recession really hit, we made mid-course corrections. We came to the council, as I recall, in October of that year, right after the recession hit, and said, we need to cut the budget another $2 million. We can't afford to wait. And that we've been much more diligent now about coming back and making mid-course corrections in order to make sure we didn't use any reserves. But I think the challenge is going to be the next time we come to you and say, use reserves, and then if the council says, but we need a plan on how to restore it, is that may mean the following year that we have to cut the budget more in order to pay those reserves back. And I think it's probably the right thing to do, but it is going to require a lot more fiscal discipline.
Okay, thank you. And I'll be just listening to see how all this gets over into policy as opposed to operational. Like from an administrator executive level, the way you've been operating it, you've had the discretion in those areas. And when it comes to policy, then it's the board saying these are the parameters under which you'll be operating. And I'll be listening carefully to see how that could be really functional and work well.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Armstrong, do cities ever set aside a portion of revenues and just say that's untouchable to accomplish the kind of difference we're talking about here?
Well, in effect, we've done that with that green area. We've said we're only going to use it for disasters. That's the only time we're going to use it. And I think we've followed that. When I've talked with city managers all over the state, there's no, everybody does it differently.
Differently, right.
And the devils are in the details. And it really is the devils are in the details, because sometimes you can look at this and you say, oh, there's the general fund reserve. And though I can tell you in some city budgets, you'll also find reserves in other places. As Bob indicated, we have the reserves for equipment, reserves, we have some computer replacement, fairly modest, but I can tell you there's other cities that have, they'll say, oh, we only have 10% reserves in our general fund, but they have other reserves. So that's what's difficult. I mean, as I look at this and I know what our other reserves, we're in good financial condition, and I think it's really important that we're healthy. Would we rather be in better financial position? Yes.
Right.
But we're still in good financial condition. Our reserves right now, on a percentage basis, and I think actual dollar basis in the general fund, are higher than the county's general fund reserves, and their general fund budget.
Not sure that's a good comparison, but
I think they're double or triple what ours is. In school districts, for example, the state requires that they have a 3% reserve of their general fund, and most of them are just right there at 3 to 5%.
right.
But trying to find, and I think what we'll do when we go back to the Finance Committee is we'll do a listserv check with cities throughout the state to find their reserve policies, but they're all over the map. That's what's difficult.
So knowing just how human nature is, unless you sort of put something aside and pretend it's not there, it somehow gets used. I mean, so would it be appropriate or possible for the council to say, okay, for a quarter or half of 1% of our revenues, right off the bat, whenever it goes into making up the difference here until we complete that difference. And that would take a long time. That's not a lot of money, but at least it would always be adding rather than deducting.
And certainly that's a council policy, and that's one way to do it, is say take a 0.5% off the top and use it to replenish reserves.
Right. Well, I'd like to suggest to my fellow council members, I don't see any other way of doing it, even though that makes life difficult. But down the line, it could really pay off.
Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Samario, I had a question for you. You mentioned the automobile replacement fund, but that's not, is that a part of an enterprise?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rouse, those are considered internal service funds, like our self-insurance fund, our vehicle replacement fund, our the motor pool, all internal service funds. They're not subject to the reserve policies, but they do have reserves that they accumulate for the benefit of general fund departments as well as enterprise fund departments for vehicle replacement or whatever purpose they're designed for.
Okay. Well, do you have something to say, Mr. Armstrong?
Yeah, and I think part of what we just wanted in calling out to your attention is back 6-7 years ago, we didn't used to have reserve for vehicles, for example. We just funded out of capital, and we decided it was better to set those aside so we didn't have a fire truck that we had to replace and all of a sudden go, oh, we can't afford it next year. Likewise, with our insurance reserves, we were $3-4 million below our actuarial required reserves a few years ago, and we've turned that around, and that never showed up on this chart. And yet we're in much better shape there. So part of it's to recognize that there's more than just the general fund going on here.
Yeah, I mean, just to dovetail a little bit on where Mr. Hotchkiss, I think, might have been going was kind of the rainy day fund idea where government tends to, doesn't like deficits, but really doesn't like surpluses either. So, what do you do with funds like in 2004 when you're well over council policy reserves? And I don't know if it's ever practiced for anybody to have a flat line, like you obviously want to go percentage of capital assets for your book valued enterprise fund capital assets, but flat line for operational assets, because as anybody in the private sector will tell you, it doesn't look like this, it looks more like that. And that's, where in the private sector, of course, we can squirrel away money and save it in our rainy day fund, where I guess municipalities, that's a little bit of a trickier proposition. Now, clearly we're not looking at rainy day funds for a while, but I didn't know if there was any chance further on down the road, if there were ways to set policy where when you were in excess, that they didn't necessarily have to be expended just to get them off the books. Is that just one of those too far out there questions?
No, you can, that's all, if the council directs us to do it, that's what we can do. I think where it was challenging, and if you look back, I think I looked at a 10-year chart, a lot of those monies also went towards capital in the general fund back so it wasn't just going to operating. We really invested in infrastructure back in the kind of mid 2000s. So, and that was just because one of the things you don't see here is we have a huge unfunded liability of capital in the general fund, which is primarily buildings, facilities. Of course, you know about the police facility, but probably of just as much concern is parks and recreation facilities, which is the big dog in the general fund in terms of capital needs.
Well, like Mr. Hotchkiss, I would like to see the Finance Committee go back as they've suggested and, work on this rebuilding policy and to have a very regular check-in with council.
Thank you for the discussion. First off, I'm so glad finally we're talking about this. When I was on the Finance Committee 4 or 5 years ago, I kept saying, when are we going to get rid of that 1 million capital number? Because $1 million today for capital is nothing compared to $1 million in 1995 when this was first put together. So at the very least, I hope we change that. And so this conversation's been happening for a long time, and I'm pleased to see that we're finally going to create something. But that blue 1 million capital reserve makes no sense to me whatsoever. I do have a couple of questions. You mentioned earlier the other funds, the self-insurance fund, motor pool, so forth. How much, do you know off the top of your head how much in reserves in there are? And it was established, about 6-7 years ago? 10 years ago?
Madam Mayor, the self-insurance fund has been around for a while.
Okay. But the motor pool one in particular?
The motor pool one we've always had, but we never really started building up reserves
Right.
until fairly recently for replacement. It was more of on a pay-as-you-go basis.
What's the value of that right now?
God, I think in the motor pool fund, we maybe have somewhere around $4 or $5 million, half of which we might relate to the general fund, another half to enterprise funds.
About 2 to 3 million general fund in the motor,
That's rough.
more or less.
Yeah, in our self-insurance fund, at one point we had $5 million back in maybe 2003 or 4. We're up at one point up to $12 million. We were probably we've used about $3 or $4 or $5 million in the last few
Right.
years alone to help the general fund because of excess that we had in there from basically because of good results actuarially.
Right.
But that number has almost doubled in the risk management fund.
And both those two, structuring those funds in that way started about when?
Again, I think the motor pool we structured sometime about 2003 or 4. We started saying, let's start putting some money really on a real-time basis to build up the reserves for vehicle replacements. The self-insurance fund has always worked that way.
Right.
We've just had some really bad years in the early 2000s where those numbers went down.
I think that chart is a dramatic chart, and I understand why we're looking at it. I don't think it tells the entire story. I think it leads to good discussions that we're having today, and I agree with my colleagues. We need to have some guidelines. But I think when the Finance Committee looks at this, I would suggest a couple of things. One is to look at those other funds that we did actually set aside money towards other needs and said we're not touching it except for this purpose, like the motor pool fund that normally could have been in that chart, but it's not because we made those policy decisions. I'd also suggest looking looking at these policies in light of the infrastructure financing task force recommendations that happened a couple of years ago. That was, a group of community, a major blue ribbon commission almost of, putting some really good recommendations. And I think one of them was that the general fund should spend 1% of its budget each year on general fund capital improvements, the thought being spending now on improving something will save us money in the long run, as things become more and more dilapidated. That's still an issue for the county and for the city and our city buildings. So the question of when is it okay to dip into these funds, I think you have to look at the, is improving a capital improvement parks building, for example, a good reason to dip into these funds or not, given the status of the life cycle of the building, those kind of questions. And just a little historical context, I'd also suggest that perhaps go back to those budget meetings in these years here from 2005 to current, when the reserves did go down, and say, well, what was it that we spent it on? Was it just salaries and benefits? I mean, I know, for example, there was a huge retention concern in the police department. And part of the MOU with the last PD, with the Police Officers Association, it was a big contract because there was a major concern about retention and spending a lot of money on recruitment and then people leaving and needing to move the salaries up. And some of the reserves was used for ongoing salary and benefits there. But there were other things such as some capital improvements that Mr. Armstrong talked about. I remember bike patrols wanting to come back around 2007. I think we used some reserve money to augment that. The school district at some point in that period of time had to cut back on their after-school programs, and we made a decision to use some reserve money to help offset those cost cuts from the school district and actually pay ourselves for those programs, because after school programs for especially junior high school kids were very important. So I'm not defending anything. I'm just saying it'd be good to see what the rationale was of why the council at the time chose to spend reserve money in order to help figure out, well, what kind of guidelines, if you want to say what are appropriate reasons to go into reserves, what happened before. I also kind of remember, I think there was some assumptions made around 2006, 2007 about increased revenue sources like parking tickets and things, and then we didn't see those revenues. So we thought we were going to have a balanced budget and then didn't, because people were paying their parking tickets on time, so we didn't get the extra amount for the late payment fee, and we were put that in the budget, so those kind of assumptions went away. I think that information would be helpful in terms of making those determinations of general guidelines to help future councils in the future. And I do think when we present future budgets and reserves, we need to look at all things that are basically discretionary in terms of general fund monies. I mean, I think the enterprise funds are working well, and those policies seem to be working, that's not the issue here, because it's not as volatile in terms of where the revenue sources come from. It's not about the economy back and forth with sales tax and TOT and property tax. But to give ourselves credit for putting money into purchase fire trucks and and street sweepers or whatever else is needed. So to have a bigger picture there. But I'm glad this is moving forward and look forward to hearing the Finance Committee's recommendations coming back. What would be the timeline for this?
Madam Mayor, I think that we can expect that in mid to late August we can go to the Finance Committee, whether it's one meeting or two or three, whatever is needed, and then probably in October or so coming back to full council.
Thank you. Mr. House.
Mr. Samario, there's actually something that the mayor just mentioned with the infrastructure subcommittee or their recommendations. I mean, they were also recommending almost like another level of reserve, a capital sinking fund, basically, putting money aside in advance for major capital improvements, not waiting until we had to borrow the money or float bonds and things. And that would be actually another, it wouldn't be just $1 million in capital, it would be a significant number of increasing amounts of funds in advance. So I just want to remind us that that was one of their significant recommendations. And unless we do something like that at some point, we're going to find ourselves truly behind the 8 ball. And I think with the police station, that's a good example. But we also have it in the other, even some of the funds the downtown parking fund, which is, we think of it as an enterprise fund, but it's really almost not. But that's a real good example. If we're not planning ahead, it's going to be, 10 or 15 years down the road, and we're going to be caught up short. One of the things that I don't see reflected here or in our discussion today, these are like a significant endowment for the city. These are performing assets. I mean, they're not performing well or haven't been recently. We know that. On the other hand, the economy's, we are all very hopeful, but we're certain that the economy is going to get better at some point. For us to be mindful of that, how much do we generate? I mean, it's part of our investment portfolio here, right? I mean, that $1 million generates income that's at the discretion of council. It's outside of the reserves. Same thing for the 16 million, whatever that is, the 15%. So we count on that money, and we count on the fact that we have discretion with regards to those funds. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. And it has been less of an amount to work with for the past few years, but certainly we're on the way out. Another part, you mentioned the pension issue, and the most recent report that we're seeing now with 30% returns and beginning to see the recovery. I mean, that was a market-based program at the state level. We know the smoothing is going to take a long time to come back around, but it was anticipated that it was going to rise back up to the 20 and 22%, somewhere in that neighborhood. Can that sustain? I don't know. They were planning on 8%, I think, at some point, but that's much better than what we've been seeing here. So, not to be just the eternal optimist, but it seems like we should consider the income that these monies produce in the equation. And then the last thing is, the policies have to really speak to the expectations the taxpayers have of getting services for the money that they contribute to the city's funds. So that just setting money aside, that's important that we do that for the rainy day, but we need to remember the reason for it was to smooth out the impacts on the community, and that's what we were doing at this time, to smooth it out so that they don't see services dramatically drop off that they've been counting on or feel are really necessary, like after-school programs for middle school and junior high school kids that could become juvenile delinquents if they didn't have that support. So anyway, I just hope that we get all of the elements of the equation into the conversation so that we don't come up short.
Okay, any other comments? Finance Committee has work to do. Great. Okay, moving on to item number 8.
Item number 8, appeals of decisions of the Planning Commission and the Single Family Design Board regarding a new residence and an additional dwelling unit at 1233 Mission Ridge Road.
Okay, we need a few minutes just for people to set up, so don't go anywhere, but we'll take a very, very brief recess. Appellant will have up to 30 minutes to give their presentation, followed by the applicant for up to 30 minutes. The public comment comes after that. If the applicant or the appellant has any time left over as part of their 30 minutes they'd like to use at the end of public comment, they're welcome to do so, and then it goes to council. So that's how it's going to work. So I'll start with staff. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, Mayor Schneider and council members. My name is Kelly Brodison, Assistant Planner with Community Development. The reason why the project I'm presenting today is 2 appeals of the decisions of the Planning Commission and the Single Family Design Board regarding a new residence and an additional dwelling unit at 1233 Mission Ridge. This is just an aerial photo that I put on a slide showing that the project is on a 31,000 square foot lot with a 9% slope in the Hillside Design District. The property is on Green Ridge Lane, a private lane which is accessed off of Mission Ridge Road, which you can see here on the upper left. And the site is situated above Arbolado Road and below High Ridge Lane. So here's Green Ridge, and here's the project site. The project consists of a proposal to build a 3,700 square foot, 2-story, single-family residence with a 400 square foot garage and an associated storage room, and also a 920 square foot one-story additional dwelling unit with a 400 square foot garage and an additional storage room. And the garage and storage area for the additional dwelling unit will be attached to the main residence. And there's also a pool, spa, and associated landscaping proposed. There is an existing single-family residence, 1,600 square feet, and a 700 square foot accessory building, and a 460 square foot garage, which are proposed to be demolished. And you can see here the main house with the garage beyond on the right, and the accessory building on the left, and the large lawn area. The purpose of today's hearing, as I said, is to review the appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of the performance standard permit and the additional dwelling unit, and for the additional dwelling unit, and the Single Family Design Board's decision to grant a project design approval for the overall project and site design. Here's a slide showing, again, the project site, and I just wanted to orient you to the project site and where the appellant's house is, right here on the corner of Mission Ridge and Green Ridge Lane. The appeals have been filed by Mark Chatillo on behalf of Judy and David Denenholtz, who are the property owners at 1225 Mission Ridge. The required approval for this project is a performance standard permit for an additional dwelling unit on a single-family zoned lot, and also design review by the Single Family Design Board for the new buildings to be greater than 17 feet in height in the Hillside Design District. A performance standard permit for the additional dwelling unit was approved by the staff hearing officer in January and on appeal by the Planning Commission on March 10th, 2011. The project was also reviewed on 5 occasions by the Single Family Design Board, and on April 25th, the Single Family Design Board determined that the proposed project, the appearance, and the overall size and design complied with the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance criteria and granted a project design approval. Additional dwelling units can be allowed on lots in single-family zones with the approval of a performance standard permit when the minimum site area per dwelling unit is available, when the location of the additional dwelling unit complies with the ordinance requirements, and when it is found that there is adequate provisions for ingress and egress. The appellant states that the performance standard permit should not be approved for the following reasons, including inadequate findings, there is not adequate lot size or ingress and egress for the additional dwelling unit. The project improperly expands a nonconforming use, it is inconsistent with the general plan, it creates a nuisance for the residents on Green Ridge Lane. The location of the additional dwelling unit is not consistent with the secondary dwelling unit requirements. There is inadequate street frontage and it will inhibit site drainage. So the new structures will comply with all the ordinance standards of the E1 zone, including height, setbacks, parking, open yard. The 31,000 square foot lot is adequate for 2 residential units. Each lot in the E1 zone requires a minimum of 15,000 square feet. The ingress and egress for each residence was reviewed and studied by the Transportation Department and the Fire Department, and they found that there is adequate access for day-to-day residents and visitors, and that Green Ridge Lane is a 20-foot wide lane accessed from Mission Ridge Road. The City Fire Marshal, who is here today if you have questions, has determined that the road is wide enough for the city fire engines and that it provides an adequate level of access for all the existing and proposed developments on Green Ridge Lane. Let's see. The appellant also opposes the SFDB's project design approval of the project, raising the issues and citing that the project is not consistent or compatible with the neighborhood. It fails to protect oak trees on site, creates a health, safety, and welfare issue for the neighbors, does not follow the good neighbor policies. It impacts public views, disturbs the natural topography, that the building is out of scale with the surrounding homes, and the proposal includes excessive grading and paving. The project was conceptually reviewed by the design board on 3 occasions, and story poles were erected to demonstrate the height and massing of the proposed building. Here's a story pole showing a view of here's a slide showing the view of the story poles from the appellant's property.
Ms. Brodesson, could you, if you have a pointer, could you point out where the story poles are? It's a little difficult to see them.
Right here. Here's a tree, and then the house is right back behind here. So That's just where they are.
Point
I
out
have-
the story poles, the actual story poles.
Yeah, okay,
the top
here's,
of them,
here's
perhaps.
one story pole. The top of it is right here.
Okay.
Right here is one.
Right, okay, I see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss, did you also have a question?
Is that a computer generated right there? Is that
No, that's
that's the existing house that I see there?
that's the existing structure, and those are the actual poles that were, the
Got it.
photos were taken the day
Okay.
the story poles were
Thank-
installed. So, let's see. The project was. In response to concerns from the neighbors and comments from the board, the applicant continued to reduce the size and massing and height of the project. And the board expressed their appreciation for the quality and style of architecture and stated that the project is well integrated with the lot. The applicant had reduced the size of the main residence, and the board was satisfied with this reduction. Here's a view from High Ridge Lane, which is just above Mission Ridge Road. Subsequent to today's meeting, the project will return to the Design Review Board for a final approval. There are also 2 mature oak trees on site, which are being preserved and integrated into the project, which is demonstrated on the site plan and in the arborist report, which is attached to the council agenda report. And the City Fire Department has reviewed fire access at Green Ridge Lane and reviewed the proposed projects. The new structures will be constructed with fire-resistant materials, and they will be equipped with automatic fire sprinkler systems. The landscaping is designed to comply with the high fire landscape guidelines, and the proposed project will actually increase the level of fire safety on this property when compared to what is there now. With guidance regarding good neighbor guidelines, with the guidance from the Single Family Design Board and input from many of the neighbors, the applicant has reduced the size and height of the project from the original design, and the resultant project is a design that was found to be compatible with the surrounding Riviera neighborhood in terms of mass, bulk, and scale. The board stated their appreciation for the reductions of the design by the applicant over the course of the previous meetings and the sensitivity of the design to maintain the oaks. In regards to public views, although the project will change views for a few of the adjacent residences, the project will not substantially degrade the visual character or quality of the site, or it will not significantly adversely affect day or nighttime views in the area. Also, the design board stated the proposed project will not result in any negative impacts to public views. I'm almost done. The project is relatively flat, so in regards to natural topography protection and grading, the proposed grading is for the foundation preparation, and the reduction of the large lawn area will result in less watering required, and the new driveway will be designed with permeable paving. And in the staff's recommendation, the proposed project conforms to the city's zoning ordinance and the policies of the general plan. The city's environmental analyst has examined the site and reviewed the proposed plans and has determined that the project will not result in a significant effect on the environment, and it's exempt from further environmental review. And therefore, staff recommends that City Council deny the appeals and uphold the decision of the Single Family Design Board for a project design approval, and the Planning Commission's denial of a prior appeal of the staff hearing officer's approval of a performance standard permit for an additional dwelling unit, and make the findings included in the council agenda report and subject to the conditions of approval in the Planning Commission resolution. And that concludes staff's presentation. We also have Jim Austin, who is here from the fire department. And we have the appellant, Mrs. Denenholtz, here, and her representative, Mr. Chitillo, is here. And we have the property owner, Mr. and Mrs. Sanborn, and the architect, Mark Shields, are also here to make a presentation.
Thank you. Any questions first from council? And we also have a planning commissioner and a single-family design review board member to speak as well. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And this is a question that would then go to the Planning Commission representative as well as the SFDB representative. The way the project was analyzed, the FAR was based on there being 2 lots, and as I understand it, and that the total square footage of development then was based on what the allowable or the customary floor area ratio is on 2 lots. And as I understand it, it's less than the FAR if it's 2 lots. The project meets city standards for FAR. But if it remained 1 lot, there's more square footage on the lot than the city would customarily allow. Could you explain staff's position, and also if there are any preceding instances where this has been considered? How does that fit into staff's analysis, and then was that considered by the other review boards as it went forward? I see Mr. Cato nodding, so you get the question that I'm asking there anyway, right?
I'll try. Chair Helene Schneider and Councilmember White, when the FARs were introduced as part of the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance, they were created originally for smaller lots, for example, lots on the Mesa. They didn't take into account projects that were large enough to have an additional dwelling unit. So the actual ordinance didn't have a tool for a person to use to calculate the FAR. So when the project first came in, staff determined how the best way to calculate the FAR was, and the applicant did what we were instructed to do. What we instructed them to do. And that was to divide the lot in half by square footage and designate 1/2 of the square footage for the additional dwelling unit and 1/2 of the square footage of the lot to the main house. And so by doing that, they calculated the floor area ratio as 99% for the main house and about 34% for the additional dwelling unit.
But as I recall, the staff report did allude to the fact that if it were looked at as a single lot, that the square footage would have been less. Is that correct?
The percentage, you mean?
The allowable FAR, not the recommended, because it's a guideline rather than a mandate, but the guideline would have meant a smaller square footage.
Mr.
Am I
Cato?
correct on that?
Mayor Schneider, Councilmember White, yes, that's correct. If we had calculated the required FAR based on one single lot, then the amount of square footage allowable would have been less than had we done it this way and split it in two. But Kelly's correct. When we came forward with the FARs, we never thought about the additional dwelling unit potential, right? The additional dwelling unit is a special performance standard permit. It used to be a CUP, but it was downgraded because it was pretty minor, right? But the idea is it's almost like a subdivision, except you don't actually subdivide the land. If you have enough land to do a subdivision to meet the zoning lot requirements, then you can have these additional dwelling units. For example, if this lot was 45,000 square feet, they could have had 3 units, et cetera, et cetera. It could go on ad infinitum with this PSP, but it doesn't make any sense to have an FAR that's made for 1 unit applied to 4 units. So that's why we decided to do it this way.
Maybe Commissioner Justice, if you'd like to come on up. Did you have a question first? Yes, Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Cato, I'm not quite sure I understand. So if you divide the lot in half, if you were to divide it in half where the main house is, it would be at 99% FAR. The additional dwelling unit is at 34%. If you add those together and average them, you'd be at 65%, right? More or less.
Mayor Schneider, Councilmember Francisco, not exactly. No, it doesn't work that way, because the FAR that you're allowed to have by these rules that were adopted say that for a given lot size you get a certain amount of square footage, a certain FAR, right? But as that lot gets bigger and bigger, it doesn't double in size of the square footage that you get. As you get bigger, the FAR gets kind of smaller and smaller.
Okay.
So that by having 2 15,000 square foot lots, you get more square footage than if you had one 30,000 square foot lot.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think during the MPO, we kept talking about the 6,000 square foot Mesa lot, and that number stuck, but in fact, it was a formula. Yeah. Glad that's over. Okay, Commissioner Justice.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. I'll be very brief. These performance standard permits are a very unique flavor of discretion for the Planning Commission. I've only seen one come before us in 7.5 years, and it is a very limited piece of discretion for us. As the name implies, if the standards for this type of application are met, we make the finding to approve the project, and that's what we did in this case. We had no discretion over floor area ratio or design. We limited ourselves to three things: meeting the minimum lot area requirement, meeting the access requirements, and considering the recommendations of the fire department, and this third one being meeting all the other zoning standards of the underlying zone. We found that to be the case in this project. There are certainly more issues that are facing you than were facing us, but when we took a look at it, we did not find a compelling reason to find otherwise, and that's why we approved the project. It's a little bit less complicated than a coastal development permit, which we see a good number of for a single-family home that's on the bluff or in the coastal zone. So this was a fairly straightforward decision for us, and we limited our discretion accordingly.
Thank you.
Questions?
Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Joseph, when you say you've only seen one of these in 7.5 years, is that because typically they're handled at the staff level, or is it just they're that uncommon?
To my experience, they're that uncommon. I've worked on and off in the city for a number of decades, and I never came across this in all my planning career, and so this is a surprise to me. So, we really kind of ratcheted down our decision making to focus on just the questions that we were asked.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Mr. Justice, what was the vote at the Planning Commission?
I don't recall.
Do we have,
Staff have that?
It's in the resolution, I believe.
Mayor Schneider and council members, the vote was 4 ayes, 0 noes, and 3 absent. Bartlett had to step down. He's part of the architect team. Lodge and Jordan were not present at the meeting.
Thank you.
Further questions?
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Mr. Zink, I know you said self in your, but I think, you were part of the Single Family Design Review Board. It'd be good for you to speak at this point. Thank you.
My name is Paul Zink, and I was the chair for a couple of the meetings. I'm no longer on the Single Family Design Board, which is why I put self down there. A couple things I want to talk about. The first having to deal with the FAR requirements. When a lot is greater than 15,000 square feet, I believe is the number, the FAR becomes a guideline. It's not a requirement. So on the larger the lots, we look at the quality and the shape of the architecture and not just the square footage numbers. We have approved a couple at 103% in town because they fit. So it's more, it gives us a baseline of how to evaluate the size of the house in relationship to the existing neighborhood and the lot size. So in this case, I think it was the second or third meeting, I personally didn't buy into this game of saying we cut the lot in half and this is 99% and this is this. No, this is a lot that has a structure or a compound or a village of 109% or 113%, whatever the number was at the time. And I said, I look at it as an entire building. I'm not playing some game of cutting it in half and all that kind of stuff. That's between the planning department. I'm looking at the physical building. That's how I chose to evaluate it as an architect. What I do want to say is the Single Family Design Board was fairly hard on this applicant in having him scale back the house. And what the previous numbers were and where he is now, there was some, he brought the house down in height, he slid it over to the side. All these things were concerns for the board and concerns from my perspective as an architect. The city of Santa Barbara does not protect private views. And that is something the city has as a policy. We protect public views and we acknowledge the impact on private views. And that's the key word, is that we have to acknowledge the impact. And so if you were at the site on Monday, you noticed that behind the house or behind the property there's a 2-story project. I think his name is Wright. I went up there and I took some photographs of his balcony and I said, I want to understand what the impact of this new construction is going to be on this neighbor. I'm not protecting his view by no means. That's not my role, but I need to acknowledge what we're doing to his view. And so in reviewing it, we look at the house and I go, my goodness, the ridge here, the this, you got to make some changes. the team made changes. The applicant or the owner, however it happened, they made the project smaller. So then when they did the story polls, we were able to go back up there a second time and review the impacts from that person's balcony. He allowed the single-family design board onto his property, and they walked that balcony. In our final vote, in which we voted to give this a preliminary or project design approval, there was one abstention, and that was Bernie Bernstein, because she was not present when the story polls were there. So she stepped down and she removed herself. So other than that, all the board members stood on this person's balcony, which is Mr. Wright, not the appellant, and looked at the impacts. I myself, as a member of the single-family design board, went to previous homes and I took pictures of people who had concerns, because I want to understand their concerns, and I emailed them to the staff, and the staff has copies. I had photographs to show, but whenever it needed to. So long and short answer is I feel the board really did study the impacts of this structure on the neighborhood, the size of the house, and the shape and the quality of the architecture. Having to deal with this, forgot what it was called, dividing the house into the lot into two houses. We did another one. I've only been on the single family design board for 4 years, but we did one like 2 years ago. It was on East Mountain Drive. There was a book. It was called the Book House, and I forget the person's name. So I've seen this twice. But you know, when you have a big, huge Mongol lot, and zoning says you can only have one house, what do? All right. There is a policy in there that allows you to have two houses under the same ownership on a big Mongol lot. And that's the game that's being played with, and it's illegal. It's in the zoning ordinance. So we've seen this before. The quality of architecture is excellent. The design is excellent. It's appropriate. The style of the home, completely appropriate for the neighborhood. The board did review this thing, so.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Francisco.
Mr. Zink, so when you looked at the story polls from the adjacent property, how would you describe the impact on the views? I realize that there's nothing in the ordinance preventing an impact on private views, but how would you describe it?
Unfortunately, I would call it disappointing. I mean, he had a fabulous view. Mr. Wright, who is directly behind him, he has a fabulous unobstructed view, and what he's looking over is somebody's one-story house. Mm-hmm. And that somebody is now going to put a two-story house there. And what I wanted to make sure as an architect on this thing is I didn't want to see a two-story house going from edge to edge. And there's a drawing that's in our single-family design guidelines that I brought out to the meeting, and I put it down there, and I said, you need to do something like rotate the house or move something, to not 100% obliterate somebody's view. And so now there is a slot that is available that looks here. And so it's not 100% obliterated.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
I want to repeat what Mr. Francisco said. So they made an adjustment at your suggestion.
Prior to Planning Commission, they lowered the ridge and they slid the house over. If you can look at the model, the two-story element used to go from basically ridge to ridge.
I understand.
And so prior to Planning Commission, they made this adjustment. They did the story polls, and then we looked at the house, and then since the story polls happened, there were some additional tweaks that were made.
And the house from which you were looking was not even the appellant's house, is
Correct.
that correct?
I did take pictures. I emailed and met with the appellant at their house. They have two different rooms, and I stood at the rooms, and I asked if I could take photographs, and I did a panoramic. I stitched them together, and then I drew with a little black line connecting the dots of the story poles, and I emailed them to staff, and I never had to bring that to the single-family design board. It was never needed. So is the impact from that second house, the appellant's house, less than the one from? Unfortunately, it's insignificant. I mean, it's so far away, and there's a tree that's right there. From my perspective, there is no visual impact of this house from that person's.
From the appellant's house?
Yeah, and that's what I wanted those photographs to document, what I was physically seeing that day.
Well, I have to thank you for being so thorough. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Zink. Okay, we're moving on to the appellant. Mr. Chatillo, I have 30 minutes here at the podium for you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Good
Before we
afternoon.
get started, we have some materials.
Sure. I'll stop the clock.
And what I'm handing out here is the PowerPoint presentation, the slides, and then there's a letter from that person Mr. Zink was talking about, Mr. Wright, and we have and some visual simulations I'll get into in my presentation. Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. I appreciate. I'm going to wait till you get settled in there.
Go ahead, start over. There you go.
Do
you have an extra copy?
We made
The whole
7
packet.
at the clerk's direction.
The clerk needs a copy.
Oh, I'm sorry, and you need a copy too. There's 10 of
Right.
most things. There's only 2 letters that.
That's okay. We'll make sure she gets a copy at the end.
Okay.
Okay. All right, start over. There you go.
All right. Good afternoon, members of council. My name is Mark Chatillo, and I'm here on behalf of Judy and Dave Denenholtz. And, the Denenholtzes are the owners and residents at 1225. They are close to their neighbor, the Wrights, which are in the home that Mr. Zink was talking about. So as we've brought this forward, we've wanted to make sure that the Wrights' views of the project and their concerns are also addressed, being the immediate neighbors. The Wrights are quite elderly. I don't think any of you saw Mr. Wright on the balcony during the site visit yesterday. He was out as you were leaving, but he did ask that we that transmit this letter that's in the packet here, just expressing their general feeling about the project. And well, I didn't know Mr. Wright years ago, but I was told that if this had come forward some years ago, he'd have been right here in the trenches on the issues. A little bit of the project history I want to share before I get into the presentation. The project did go, initially it was an extremely large project, and as Mr. Zink reported, the Single Family Design Board was very effective at identifying how that was inappropriate for this site and working with the applicant to bring it to something that was more in keeping with the surrounding neighborhood. And I want to thank, in particular, Mr. Zink for his efforts. He went above and beyond the call of duty in working with us, going to the Wrights' house, and really he threw himself into this, and we owe him a debt of gratitude, and he's a great servant to our city. This is an important project. I think people move to the Riviera because they care about their views, they care about their neighbors, and as we've now learned, we also have a public safety concern that's associated with living there. And the view issue, well, I'm not going to dwell on it much. I do want to just point out that the applicant had made comments at the final single-family design board that the reason that the house couldn't be lowered any further is that they needed to have that floor height in order for them to be able to look down and see the city. And as Mr. Zink reported, the effect of having that height of floor was to eclipse the view, especially of the Wrights. I think his word was their view is now going to be disappointing, as well as my clients, the Denenholtzes. And I have provided you, I just couldn't get this into a good PowerPoint format, so I printed up separately the visual simulation. I'd like to just describe that, and I'll come back to it in a minute. The first page is based on an earlier version that the story polls were based on back in March. The applicant did reduce and move the project slightly, and so the second page that you see shows images which have the house slightly reduced, slightly lowered, and there's different levels of lowering in different parts of it. And then the bottom of the second page, you see view 1 and view 2. View 1 is from the Wrights' house. View 2 is from the Denenholtz's house. And so when you flip through to the third page, view number 1, again, that's from the Wrights' house. And that's the one that you can have out in front of you, because that's really that's the biggest view impact. The view number 2 in this packet is the Denenholtz's house.
Madam Mayor,
Mr. Rouse.
a point of clarification.
Stop the clock.
Sorry. Mr. Till, are the Wrights your clients as well?
No,
They're not.
They're not my
You're
clients. They are our neighbors, the
Okay.
neighbors of my clients.
I just want to be clear on. Thank you.
And neighbors stick together, and they have a lot of concerns. These are the 2 most impacted neighbors. The Wrights are quite elderly. They're not able to be here. If they could, they would be. And so I've offered to convey their concerns. We worked with them to make sure that they had a characterization of what it would look like from their house so that you could see what their experience is going to be.
Also, another question. I'll stop the clock again.
Mr. Chatillo, view 2, revised scale perspective view.
Correct. Yes.
It appears to go through a tree?
That's correct. The view that you see, this image here, is a computer-generated image by Mr. Dowd, who prepares visual simulations for the city. The tree part has been removed. Trees, vegetation are transient. The house is not.
Okay, but right
this is
now-
what the view would look like without the tree there.
Okay, but the trees are there right now.
There is one tree that's there, yes.
Well, is one bifurcated? Looks like two
It looks like,
trees.
yeah, it is. And that's located on the Wright's property. It's
Okay,
not
so
on the
right now
Dannhausen's
that's-
land.
However, temporarily, that blocks their view.
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to understand that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to focus my presentation on a couple of key issues. First, the fire risk associated with the performance standard permit, and secondly, the CEQA issues. And as Mr. Zink indicated, his objective was to disclose what those impacts are. And it's our belief that CEQA requires a public process of disclosing what those impacts are and involving the public in that. The document that the staff has approved or presented to you for you to approve is a categorical exemption, which is the shortcut in the CEQA process that holds that it is a kind of project that has no possible significant impact. And if there is any substantial evidence in the record that there is a potentially significant impact, then you cannot use the exemption. And the last opening comment I wanted to make is because this project your decision does involve property rights, it involves public safety. There are three commissioners didn't participate. One because he was a member of the firm that was the applicant's team. A second because her house was proximate to it. I don't remember that Commissioner Jordan had a reason for not participating in the decision. But I noticed, and I learned yesterday that the law firm that represents Mr. Sanborn and the applicant also has a family member which is sitting on the Planning Commission. That person did not recuse themselves. So it's our request that we also go through a process at some point in your hearing, Madam Mayor, to disclose all ex parte communications and all information that may have been brought to bear besides that information that has been presented as part of the record. So now I'd like to move on to my presentation.
Excuse me, you're implying conflict of interest. Who is this?
I'm not, well, what I'm
you wouldn't have brought it up
requesting-
if you weren't implying it, so what's up?
Well, I would like to, what I'm requesting that there be a disclosure of all communications.
Okay, so what's your disclosure?
Of your communications with anybody involved in this process.
So the one that you just brought up, you said somebody on the Planning Commission had a dubious relationship? What's the deal here?
There's a member of your Planning Commission's husband
Okay.
is a partner in a law firm that represents the applicant.
Okay.
In other circumstances, that member has recused herself from participation. I just learned of this yesterday, of this relationship, and she's here in the audience. So I think it's appropriate that at least we have for this hearing a complete airing of all the evidence that you're going to consider as you undertake your decision making. It's a request. I haven't been able.
I see Mr. Wiley moving up to the. Do you want to, or do you want to just wait? However you want to handle this.
Well, I thought I heard the staff indicate that Ms. Jacobs did not participate in this Planning Commission hearing.
I think it was Lodge, Jordan, and
I misunderstood then. Okay.
and Bartlett.
Well, that really isn't an issue for us. It's just not our issue. Who knows when this law firm was retained?
Okay.
And so it's a timing issue, and it's really something that should be taken up with the Fair Political Practices Commission if someone feels there's a potential conflict of interest. But it's not a city issue.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start the clock again.
And just to be clear, you may start the clock. Just to be clear, it's our request as a voluntary basis that there be a disclosure so that we understand what evidence is
Madam Mayor,
reported,
that's
and
just a Public Records Act request, and if Mr. Shatillo wants to make give it to us in writing what communications he's asking for under the Public Records Act, we'll certainly provide him with anything that falls under the Public Records Act. But again, that's not something we're going to deal with today.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
You're at 24 minutes.
Thank you. This is Green Ridge Lane, if we can start moving through the slides. And this is a lane that in the Oakland Hills after the 1991 fire. Next slide. We don't want Green Ridge Lane to look like that. And one of the principal concerns that we have here is for the fire issues. Next slide, please. This appeal is being filed principally focused on
Mr. Chitillo, I got to ask.
Yes.
I remember seeing that picture in Berkeley.
Yeah.
Was that a dead-end lane?
If we go back, there we go. No, this is, as I understand it, this is taken from an intersection. This was from the Oakland Hills fire in 1991 where 23 people died. Most of the people died were trapped in their cars trying to evacuate. This is not as far as I can I believe that this is an intersection right here. I'm not sure where the road goes on to.
Okay, but it's not a dead-end lane in any case.
We're
dealing with a dead-end lane here. So.
No, it's not the dead-end part that's our concern. It's the evacuation from that lane and out. That's
Perhaps we can hold off on our questions until he's finished with his presentation. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. Okay. Thank you. That's all right.
Of course.
Go ahead.
So this appeal is filed because this project is located in an area that we know is prone to wildfire. It has been designated by your city's fire plan as being in an extremely high fire hazard area in the foothill zone. And while we have had an unfortunately great deal of experience in practicing our evacuations and hopefully avoiding the problem of people getting caught in their cars, I can tell you based on personal experience that it doesn't always go as you practice. And when fires come through and move quickly, you don't always have the ideal conditions. And so it's our belief that the finding that you have to make under the zoning ordinance that there is adequate egress and ingress to this property in order to allow the second additional dwelling unit is substantially implicated with the fire risk, and indeed that the surrounding circumstances of this parcel make it such that you should not, in good conscience, approve that second dwelling unit based on the access problems. The roadway, as I'll show later in my presentation, fails to meet the city's own standards or the standards associated with the California Fire Code. And we have a history of emergency access issues associated with cars parked on the lane, making it such that emergency vehicles could not make it to the rights, our neighbors that we've talked about already, and required a manual extrication in order to get them out of to address a medical emergency. Nothing to do with wildfire, but it exemplifies the concern that we have with respect to emergency access. Right now, the property has a guest house, but a guest house is different from a second unit. The city has a policy in its general plan and in its zoning ordinance that second homes, second residences are not permitted in the high fire hazard areas. There is apparently an exception that staff has interpreted with respect to the performance standard permit. In order to grant the performance standard permit, you have to make the discretionary determination that there is adequate ingress and egress. And I think that our argument is that based on the circumstances of this project, you should and cannot make that finding, and that will fulfill the general plan policy that says you do not have additional dwelling units or second dwelling units up in the high fire hazard area. So our concern is over intensification of the site intensity, and then finally the concern that we have with respect to the CEQA process. So next slide, let's talk a little bit about the site. Large lot on the Riviera, designated high fire hazard area. The general plan policy as well as the zoning ordinance specify that secondary dwelling units are banned in the high fire hazard area. Now, the performance standard permit uses a different term. It's not a secondary residential unit. It is an additional dwelling unit. And staff has taken the position that an additional dwelling unit is different from a secondary unit, and so therefore it's allowable if you make this permit, if you make this finding. Green Ridge Road is a private road. It's not public. It narrows to 14 feet wide and it also widens out to 20 feet in some places and narrows to 16 feet for a considerable portion. And significantly, there are 6 homes that currently share the road, and should it be approved, should this project go forward, there would be 7. The project itself, involves demolishing the, I call it a potentially historic house. It has historical features. There was a historical study done. The city's urban historian made a determination it wasn't significant, so it is proceeding. However, I think it's important, since there's not been any of the information that's been presented to you from staff, that you're aware of the historical significance of the site. And it also would involve the demolition of the guest house. It's going to replace all the existing structures with 2 complete residences, the main house and the additional dwelling unit. Some of the other numbers, looking at gross numbers, you heard net square footage. That is the interior parts of the house. The exterior, including the overhangs and the eaves. The covered space is 8,522 square feet. If you add up all the coverage from the pool, the paving, the patios, it totals the development paving total over 15,000 square feet, and the roof line reaches 28.6 feet at its tallest point. Turning now to the performance standard permit that you're going to have to remove, you're going to have to review. It is discretionary. This is not ministerial, and I would take some question or raise some issue with respect to Mr. Joseph's comment that they just approved these. It's not a ministerial action. It is discretionary. It enables this additional residential unit. The ordinance is silent as to an additional unit in the high fire hazard area, and as I mentioned, staff distinguishes between the prohibited secondary unit and the additional residential unit. The required findings that you have to make, adequate lot size, and I'm going to focus on adequate provisions for ingress and egress. The zoning ordinance and the state fire code specify a 20-foot minimum width for any road, private or public, that serves more than 4 residences. As I indicated, the actual width is as little as 14 feet, and in many places is less than 16. Here's the fire code itself that you adopted last year, and it makes it very clear, not less than 20 feet of unobstructed width in order to serve 4 or more units. Again, here's a photo of the road as viewed from above, and there are cars parked here. There's no prohibition against parking, but the width that we've measured are of it unobstructed, and yesterday when you came and visited, it was unobstructed. Looking the other direction up towards Mission Ridge Road, you'll see that there's a fairly steep hill here and a fairly acute angle. So the reason why we don't believe that you should be able to make the provisions, the findings, is that Green Ridge Lane does not meet the fire code. There's no apparent turnaround, and excuse me, Madam Chair. Okay, 60 minutes, thank you. I thought I was down to 11. Green Ridge Road does not meet the fire code. There's no apparent turnaround or hammerhead at the bottom of the hill. And what's going to happen in an emergency situation is it's not going to be the crew from Station 7 that are going to respond to this in a wildfire. It's going to be a crew that comes from Santa Clarita or some other place. And they're going to look down that road. They're going to say, well, if I drive down that road, I'm going to have to back this truck back up. Same time, you're going to have residents trying to evacuate. You could have people coming off of the construction site, bringing their materials and tools off, and you could have other emergency responders that are trying to use this 14-foot roadway. The combination of the acute turn geometry and the steep slope at the top, combined with the surrounding area where throughout the Riviera and the foothill zone you have narrow and curvy roads and chronic access issues. And this project is going to simply going to perpetuate and exacerbate these access problems. So for these reasons, we feel you shouldn't make the findings. And I'm going to have retired Fire Marshal Don Oakes come up in just a minute and talk about some of these fire issues in greater detail. So you hear it from the horse's mouth, somebody who actually does know the fire issues from a professional basis. So the next issue I want to touch on quickly is the CEQA issue and the improper use of the categorical exemption. The categorical exemption under CEQA eliminates environmental review based on the supposition that there is no possibility of a significant impact, no possibility whatsoever. The courts have said categorical exemptions are to be narrowly construed, and they are disallowed when there is evidence of any potential significant impact. We don't have to show that there is a significant impact, just a potential one based on substantial evidence. And there is an exception to when a categorical exemption can be used, which applies here, when there are unusual circumstances that create a reasonable possibility that the activity will have a significant impact. And again, it's the fair argument standard there. So all we are required to do is to establish, based on substantial evidence, including the expert opinion of someone who has looked at the site, to establish a potentially significant impact, and the city is disallowed from using the categorical exemption. What are the unusual circumstances we have here? Well, there is the high fire hazard area. You have the nonconforming road width. And significantly also, you have inconsistencies with the policies and the standards that are intended to reduce impacts. And that's language that the courts have relied on to say, well, if there are policies, standards that are supposed to reduce impacts and the project conflicts with them, that itself is substantial evidence supporting a fair argument of a significant impact. Here, the city guidelines, while the height limit is 30, the recommendation for this zone is 25-foot maximum height. Here, the maximum height is 28.5 feet. The road width for your code must be 20 feet for any road servicing 4 or more houses. Well, it's actually 14 to 6 feet. And it exceeds the FAR guidelines, and I want to talk a little bit about the FAR guidelines right now. I only have one copy of the page out of the Single Family Design Board compatibility guidelines, but I have drawn from that staff has chosen to split the project into 2 pieces. They also have guidelines for a 3/4 acre parcel, which is what this is. 30,000 square feet is about 3/4 of an acre. And so if you look at the guidelines for maximum house size for a 3/4 acre parcel, you'll see that while the guidelines are 4,100 square feet for the house, the project is 500 square feet more than that. Similarly, when you add the garage, you can see that the project exceeds it considerably. And when you look at what the Preservation Ordinance guideline provides for and the practices of the Single Family Design Board, in using this as a guideline, not an ordinance, they prefer to see they use an 85% as somewhat of a yardstick. And as you can see, that number is exceeded by a fairly sizable percentage. So this is a large house. Now, that is significant from a CEQA perspective because when you exceed the guidelines, that creates a fair argument of a potentially significant impact. Staff's approach has been to create this fictional lot split and arbitrarily assign the FAR to those 2 lots. I've argued that, well, if you're going to assume that this lot is going to stay together, then there should be a condition that the lot cannot be split in the future, but there's nothing that prohibits this owner or a subsequent owner from moving forward to try and split the lot in the future once they get these houses approved. So it's kind of having it both ways, and that is something that we find troubling from a precedential perspective due to the other homes and the other parcels that share similar circumstances to this one. So moving on to the CEQA thresholds, which are the yardsticks by which you determine whether an impact could be potentially significant. Appendix G, since the city doesn't have any thresholds, we look to the state thresholds, whether a project would conflict with any applicable land use plan, policy, or regulation adopted for the purposes of avoiding or mitigating an environmental impact. Well, it conflicts with the road width standards, it conflicts with the height guidelines, it conflicts with the FAR guidelines, and it conflicts with the general plan prohibition against additional or secondary dwelling units in the high fire hazard area. So not only is there a fire issue which I'm about to turn to, there also is a fair argument of a significant land use impact associated with this project on this site. So turning now to the CEQA thresholds for public safety, Appendix G, again, the state yardstick. If a project would expose people or structures to a significant risk of loss, injury, or death involving wildland fires, including where wildlands are adjacent to urbanized areas. Well, that's where we are. What are those risks? The public health and safety risks associated with the narrow roadway include the fact that the narrow roadway precludes two-way traffic. You can't evacuate while the emergency responders are trying to access the site. If you have an accident or a stalled vehicle that blocks evacuation or blocks access by your emergency responders, you have a potentially significant issue there, certainly an increase in the significant risk. The project adds another full-fledged residence, not a guest house, not a temporary residence, but a full-fledged separate house. And it's going to have use and intensity which is different from that of a guest house, and that contributes to the additional significant risk. And then we have the construction fire risks and evacuation issues that are largely ignored throughout this process. The last CEQA threshold that applies is associated with the emergency evacuation if a project impairs the implementation or interferes with an emergency response or evacuation plan. The city has adopted a wildlife, as part of the wildfire plan, did some planning on the evacuation blocks. Next slide show there it's tricky right above the word roble are the two arms of the lower one being Green Ridge Road where this project is. Next slide shows, actually skip forward one slide please and we'll come back. Oh, never mind, skip back. The evacuation issues, please go back one more. Evacuation issues, we have a report from the city's auditor associated with your assessment program that was adopted back in May of last year, which identified the problems associated with these roads. The wildfire itself identifies issues with the roads, and of course we've heard from Greece. We've seen the experiences in Greece, New Zealand, and Oakland. Professor Kova did a study of this in the Mission Canyon area, and he concluded that, next slide please, that residential development in these fire-prone areas is continuing without commensurate improvements in the community-based transportation egress systems. And then finally, there's a slide showing the evacuation routes. We'll see that picture one more time of the Oakland Hills fire. And then I'd like to bring up Don Oakes, who has been the fire marshal for 20 years with the County of Santa Barbara, now retired. I asked him to give us his expert opinion as to these risk issues and the effect of this project on the city's risks and those associated with the other residents. Thank you. Mr. Oakes.
Mayor, council members, Don Oakes, 2650 Latigo Drive, Solvang, California. Mine's a fairly single-focused issue here, and I think a little apology in order. First, I'm going to change my approach just a little bit based on the material that Mark has covered. Interest of time and your time, I don't want to repeat, and much of what Mark said, I think he covered it fairly effectively. I'll make a couple of kind of disjointed comments first and then read a couple of comments that I made. The COVA slide that you just saw, COVA essentially looks at a limited access area, much like a high-rise building. In other words, there'd be an entry point and an exit, and then all of those features of that building would contribute to the safety, and it should be limited. Each occupancy, each floor would have an occupancy limitation, and each compartment would have an occupancy limitation, and there'd be certain flow measures. And with exiting, that width would get larger as you got closer to the exit to accommodate those larger the numbers of people. And just the little point is that the 14-foot constriction on here is at the essentially what would be the bottom floor of the high-rise building. So that's just one kind of side note concern. But let me kind of take a run at it this way. I'm going to read you a couple of these things that I just jotted down, once again, in the interest of time. I'm not here representing any organization. I've been involved in a lot of organizations over the years. So I'm not representing those organizations, but I do represent the experience that I gained from associating with those organizations, fire organizations. And I stay involved now. I'm still actively involved in working with fire programs. I arrived in Santa Barbara, met Bendy White shortly after I arrived here back in 75, and one of my first fires was the Sycamore Canyon fire. It gave me a sense of the three-dimension aspect of this kind of a fire. I was used to municipal fire protection where fire stayed where it started. It stayed in the building. And now I come up here and I find fire jumps out of the box and it runs off in places that you didn't want it to, and it gets behind you and it does a lot of things that are bad things. So it was a new thing for me, and it was an exciting thing actually. If you can find some positive from that, I developed a passion for it. So from that point on, my focus in the fire service has been, and being fire marshal for the county was important to have this as a skill set and a competency. The wildland-urban interface fire, and that's what we're dealing with here. Now, these are fires you know well. My Sycamore Canyon fire was the first for me, but for you folks, the Eagle Canyon fire and the Painted Cave fire, and more recently the T and the Jesucita. I mean, these are fires that you guys know and understand. And you need to think in terms of this community already having a risk. Now, I've been on site. I've looked at that area. This is almost a poster child for the kinds of areas where people die in fires. Not just residents, but firefighters die in these kinds of fires. We've had a number of firefighter fatalities just within the last several years here in Southern California. And if you'd looked at this setting and driven in there, it's the same kind of construct. It's the same basic situation that we would have found in Cabazon or in a number of other places where we've lost those firefighters. In fact, though the slide of the cars at the Oakland fire weren't necessarily on point with respect to the little road that we're talking about, the concept is still the same. In other words, if you have a pathway for people to get out, it doesn't take much to block it. You can block it with a single car, as the anecdotal commentary about the ambulance not being able to get in recently down that particular road.
I just want to say you're down to 4 minutes.
Oh, well, then I will speed it up. I joined a four-service team, incident commander and incident command team, and worked major fires throughout the state. I'll skip through some material. Project in front of you is a good example of why we have the losses, hundreds of homes, and life loss and injury. This is an extreme risk area. Adding built area and additional people and additional legal household increases the risk of life and property loss as a result of such fire. I would encourage you not to make that decision. You have an excellent fire department. I put them on a par with my own and consider that high praise. But other departments, as Mark pointed out, will be not familiar with these roads, will be coming to help. They and your own firefighters are at risk, as well as the residents. And if you allow this kind of extension and intensity of development, access and egress are the biggest problems, and they'll be exacerbated here. Mother Nature's going to make a big black spot out there. I mean, the wind and the weather and just the situation that you have here means the fire is going to be a given size. All you can do, is help protect the people that are there, reduce that loss. There's a number of ways you can do that. And one of the ways you can do that is not allow the kind of piecemeal development and the kind of extension and intensity of use that we're talking about here. There's another thing that I'm almost reluctant to bring it up because it's politically volatile, and that's climate change. But regardless of what you think about climate change and where you think it comes from and who causes it, presently the discussion in the fire service, in the professional fire service, is the intensity, the frequency of fires, and the size of those fires dramatically increased over the last decade or so. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. The codes, in fact, that we have now, even the codes that we aren't adhering to here, may be insufficient to provide the kind of protection that we need. Just say that you're in a position to make the right decision here today. Tell your fire department, and it probably goes without saying, the way this project increases the risk is it adds built area, it adds a household, a full-fledged legal household, and when you add area, you have property damage potential. When you add people, you have life loss potential, and you also have an increase in the likelihood of fire. The three main causes of fire: men, women, and children. And so what you're doing when you put more people in there, you're going to have a number of those increases. Anyway, tell your fire department that you appreciate what they do. Excellent fire department, and do them a favor. Overrule their recommendation in this case, because it's best for them, it's best for your community. Thank you. I'd entertain any questions you might have.
Sure. Why don't we wait? You have a minute 9 left if you have to conclude, and then we'll see if you have any questions from council.
At this point, I think you've heard, and I will retain the rest of my time for rebuttal.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Any questions from council for the appellants? Okay. There might be some a little later. Why don't we move to the applicant then?
Mayor Schneider, members of the council, I'm Tom Sanborn. I'm here today with my wife Barbara, our design team Mark Shields, and Melissa Sonarli, and fortunately many of our neighbors and friends. Mark and Melissa have prepared a kind of an overview of the project. I know you have a good understanding of it, but if you'd indulge it, maybe a 10-minute, 5-minute overview, and then I'd like to address a couple issues that came up. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Mayor Schneider and members of the council. I'm Mark Shields, here representing the architectural firm of Design Arc, and our clients Tom and Barbara Sanborn, who are also architects. Please bear with me while I explain the design process, which we have successfully finally navigated. Thank you. I know you've already seen this overall site map, but once again, the Sanborn's property located on the southern side of the Riviera. Access to the property is from Mission Ridge Road, which is down here, up over Mission Ridge continues up over Los Alturas eventually. So we're on the southern side with city and ocean views. Green Ridge Lane is the access driveway that leads you to the property, and then above it is High Ridge Lane, and below the property is Arbolado Road. I'd like to point out that it's a large lot, over 31,000 square feet, which we've already mentioned. Its slope is relatively flat, it's under 10%, which is rare for the southern side of the Riviera. Mostly very sloping on that side, and this is relatively flat. That makes it a unique lot. As we've discussed and you've heard previously, it satisfies all requirements for the performance standard permit, and there are no public street or frontage for public views surrounding the project. In the very beginning, we thought it was important when we started the project to do a community outreach. That was back in 2010, and the Sanborns were kind enough to go around to their neighbors and discuss the project before they really got started in earnest. And it ultimately led in quite a few signatures of support, further letters of support, and just most recently we have 12 new letters of support from the surrounding residences. So those people may or may not be here tonight to express their support for the project, but I wanted to point out that we have few opponents. Getting into the existing site plan a little bit, I wanted to point out that the proposed footprint of the house and cottage is here. This is the proposed new footprint of the house and cottage. Here's the cottage. I wanted to point out the existing footprint here of the existing house, which we proposed to remove, which was, we had it looked at with a historic consultant, and it was deemed not sensitive historically, so we can remove it technically. I wanted to also point out the removal of the existing legal non-conforming garage, which is also in the setback, and also the removal of the existing two-bedroom cottage here, which is also in the 10-foot setback. We've essentially moved the cottage north on the site with our new designs, therefore eliminating some of our interior yard encroachments and actually increasing the neighbor's privacy to the south here. I also want to point out that the cottage location, the new cottage location, actually improves fire access, whereas now the hose pools are much closer to the end of the road versus the existing condition. On site, luckily and fortunately, we have two beautiful oak trees, which are over, I believe, 50 feet tall, which has always been a site, a good thing for us, and also helped us determine where we were going to site our project. We chose to locate the house adjacent to the oaks, as well as the cottage adjacent to the oaks on the north. We have an arborist letter which supports our building footprint location. He's actually fine with the location of the two projects. All of this site planning results in a new building footprint that integrates the two proposed structures with the existing oaks and the site. These are two photos of the existing oaks, and they're really quite beautiful. I also wanted to just remind you that we are removing this existing guest house. We're removing the existing residence, which is here, and beyond you can see the small existing non-conforming garage. The removal of the garage and the existing guest house, pulling those structures away from the property lines, increases the privacy of our neighbors to the west and also our neighbors to the south. There's just a photo of the side of the existing garage showing you how close it is to our southern neighbor's property line and fence. So I think that's a drastic improvement for our neighbors on two sides. I wanted to speak about the overall site planning for a moment, and I think the operative word here is really working with the Single-Family Design Review Board and the neighbors over about a year in time, listening to their comments, listening to neighbors' questions and comments, listening to the Design Review Board's comments, making numerous changes to help everyone feel comfortable about our project. We had about 5 meetings over that year, and I think we've reached a nice solution. Overall, it's important to note where we started with our project. This orange dotted line indicates where the house was initially in terms of overall footprint and location. Over time, we studied the project, and we were concerned as well about the size of the house. We were able to figure out a way to reduce the overall massing and footprint. So now you can see this is where we finally ended up with in terms of our overall footprint. And you can see, if you could bring that orange line back for a second, Melissa, the significant shifts north for the project and the reduction in size. And also, we were able to shift the house more easterly, which helps to open up the view corridor for the Wrights home, which was mentioned earlier by Mark Chitillo. By shifting the house to the center of the property, it enables us to really respect our neighbors all around the property. We're not going to one side or the other. Essentially, the project is in the exact center of the site. The required setbacks, I might point out, are only 10 feet all the way around. And on the front of the house, on the southern side, we're about 66 feet. So we're exceeding the required setbacks. Let's see, we plan to remove the large water-consuming lawn, which is located right here. And we face the building south for passive solar gain and also future solar panels. I want to speak for a moment about our portal entry design, which is here. This portal, which is a nice architectural feature that the Single-Family Design Review Board really caught on to and supported, really acts as an ending, a nice architectural ending to Green Ridge Lane. Instead of putting a gate up, we have a nice little entry which is on access with the Green Ridge Lane, so you can see through our arched opening to the existing oak trees on the site. So I think that's a nice feature in the neighborhood. Architecturally, it has a kind of a romantic notion to it, and you'll see some elevations of that. There you go. Thanks, Melissa. And if you could go back to the site plan for a second, thank you. We have a circular turnaround here, punctuated with a nice olive tree. This paving is all permeable, and let's see, we plan to use enhanced Cherokee Creek paving that's completely permeable in that area. Our centralized planning exceeds all the required setbacks. We've eliminated all prior encroachments, resulting in more privacy for the neighbors all the way around the project. The home is now below the FAR guidelines, and we have a minimal balance grading. If you look at the sections, I'll show you those in the future, there really is not much grading at all. We've tucked the house right down as low as we can. Any lower with our finished floor would actually be detrimental to the oak trees that we plan to be adjacent to. Let's see. moving forward, I wanted to just talk about the portal for a moment. The portal portion of the project, as I explained, it has a nice architectural ending to Greenridge Lane, and in front of it there's actually a little turnaround for people who go to the end of Greenridge Lane so they don't have to use the other neighbors' driveways. They can actually do a two-point turn down here and return up Greenridge Lane. The inspiration for the portal was taken really from Wallace Neff, or it could have been George Washington Smith for that matter. And again, the entire project has the 1930s romantic feeling that all of us love so much in Santa Barbara. So we've really tried to make the house feel historic and feel like it's always been there. Maybe it could have been the first house in the entire entire neighborhood for that matter. So those are our goals. This illustration also points out the native landscaping we plan to use. It's all drought tolerant. Speaking more specifically about the elevations and the work we've done with the Single Family Design Review Board, we've mentioned before that the oaks have always been an exciting element on the project for us, and we've tucked the tallest portion of our project, which is the second story, which has a master bedroom, up adjacent to the oak trees. The second story massing is located, like I said, just underneath the oak trees. Overall, over working with the neighbors and the Single Family Design Review Board, we were able to shift the entire project north about 7 feet from where we started, and this orange line indicates our previous footprint. We worked hard at eliminating square footage. There used to be a breakfast room here, which we eliminated and replaced with a light trellis element. There's architectural features, that go with the 1930s romanticism. Is this mirador that faces the oaks on the second floor. The project also gradually steps down in massing towards the southern side of the property. I think this slide really begins to show you the work that we've done over the year with the Single Family Design Review Board that Paul alluded to. The initial design came in with a long ridge. We had more bedrooms in mind. And although we were disappointed, we understood the point of view of the neighbors and the Single Family Design Review Board. So over time, we've worked very hard to eliminate portions of the project and reduce the overall massing. We removed a breakfast room that we had on the side here. We removed a southern deck that was off the master bedroom here, which was an issue with our neighbors to the south. We worked hard for this compromise with them, and they, I think, were very happy with it in the end. We added a delicate trellis, as I mentioned, to the east of the property, of the kitchen, which is down here. We have a nice covered living room loggia, which faces that beautiful ocean view. Again, a lot of loggias on the southern side, which, Mark Shatillo mentioned that we had extra square footage in terms of overhangs and this and that. Well, the trellises and overhangs aren't really counted in the city calculation of square footage because they're not technically somewhere where you can live. But as we all know, they're very important elements in Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara lifestyle and in Mediterranean architecture, and they also add to the push-pull aspects of the architectural design. I think that's what makes the house a beautiful house. And also, let's see, from the original design, we've actually were able to reduce it with a lot of soul searching, about 1,600 square feet from where we started. So it's a significant reduction in size. Thanks, Melissa. This is the westerly elevation, and again, this orange line signifies where we started. And primarily, the Single Family Design Review Board convinced us to take a look at doing something about the western side of the project to open up a view corridor for the neighbors behind. And so we completely eliminated the studio that we had here and a bridge that connected up to the master bedroom, which was adjacent to the oaks. So you can see that significantly reduced the massing on the western elevation. We also, again, pushed the project up away from our southern neighbors. This elevation is significant because this is the northerly elevation, which the appellants is the contentious elevation, I suppose. Again, the orange dotted line represents the original project design. We've completely redesigned it to help the massing step down towards the west, which essentially from the north opens up this view corridor to the ocean and the city. And I think that's probably the most important work we did with the single-family design review board. So in a sense, we are using some of the view, but we're actually sharing the view too. So we're not taking all the view away. We're working with the architecture to provide a view for the people who are to the north of us. Let's see what else. Let me go through my the blue line here actually signifies the final meeting we had with the single-family design review board, where they asked us to, is there anything else you can do after you've done all this work? What else can you do to shrink the house, to reduce massing? And so we sharpened our pencils, went back to the drawing boards, and we were able to lower the house with careful study sections, 21 inches in the center, where the center ridge is going, and about 18 on the master bedroom ridge. And by the way, the master bedroom ridge is designed to run as per single-family design review board guidelines. It runs north-south. So we're taking the tallest portion of the building and running it north-south, which helps increase the view corridor around it. Again, we've also shown the dotted line here where we eliminated square footage. Again, we eliminated square footage here where the old studio was planned to be. Yes, Melissa's asking me if you wouldn't mind taking a quick look at the model. This area here is in 3 dimensions. The stepping now that we've created down, following the contours of the site to the west, to help open up the view corridor to our neighbors to the north, both neighbors. And you'll also notice that in this model, where we are opening up the view corridor to the west, the building is predominantly one story. So that's, I think, the main work we've done has been positive in that respect. We do have a 2-story element, but it's adjacent to the oaks, which were already kind of limiting the view in that direction in the first place. Again, we took a step further even with the single-family design review board, because they wanted to make sure that we were accurate about all the work we'd done, and we did these sections. We stepped forward into working drawings a bit, created these sections with vertical dimensions to show the single-family design review board that we meant business and we know exactly where we are in elevation. About neighborhood compatibility, this map indicates, this is our site, indicates the adjacent homes that actually have larger homes on them, larger square footage than we do. You can see the chart here. We're ranked about 8th in the neighborhood in this area of the closest 30 homes. Our little cottage, of course, is way down at the bottom because it's minor in terms of square footage. In terms of FAR, again, our site, the gray properties indicate houses that are larger, have a larger FAR than we do. The chart indicates here that we're actually down to 7 or 8 in terms of the houses in the adjacent area. Moving forward to, we wanted to point out where the appellant's residence is relative to our property, and that their ocean view is primarily to the south directly. The house is oriented directly to the ocean this way, and all views that concern the Denneholtz are radically to the east. The Wright's house is here, and its primary views are also down our driveway to the ocean to the south. Again, this is taken from the existing lawn, which we plan to remove, of the Denneholtz residence, which is up behind this tree, quite a bit northwest from the project site.
You're down to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. This is looking up Green Ridge Lane and the appellant's residence behind the large tree, which you've seen in other photos. We thought it was important to take some shots from the Denneholtz residence looking towards our project, which you can barely see here. Those are the story poles sticking up. And to point out that their primary ocean view is this direction to the south. And you obviously can still see all of the ocean and a portion of the city. We moved further east on the Denneholtz residence. which is signified by this vector arrow here, looking sideways on the property, not directly out at the ocean. And you can see our existing residence with the story poles shown and the large ocean view that is still there. This is another view looking at. So again, we felt that Mark Chatello's renderings were not that accurate according to us, and so we took it upon ourselves to actually put the house in a 3D model of the existing structure that we're promoting, and also this is actually before we reduced it 21 inches per the last meeting, and actually to put in the trees, so you can see in reality what the neighbors up the street are actually looking at. Thanks, Melissa. Keep me moving. Overall project benefits. We earned unanimous positive support with 5 meetings from the Single Family Design Review Board, 1.5 years of work. We've eliminated the southern deck off the master room, eliminated the ground floor breakfast room, eliminated the second-story studio, eliminated second-story bridge, eliminated a lot of square footage for overall second-floor reductions of 1,000 square feet. And overall, we've lost a total of 1,600 square feet from where we started, all resulting in a sustainable, efficient, and neighborhood-compatible project. Overall benefits, we've listened to our neighbors in the Single Family Design Review Board, made a lot of design compromise. We think we've improved fire safety and access because the cottage is in a better location, is easily protected. We now have fire sprinklers in the structures as well. We've eliminated prior encroachments by removing the existing non-conforming structures. We've complied and exceeded setback requirements. We've integrated the existing oaks, eliminated the large water-consuming lawn, and overall the entire project conforms and is under city guidelines with square footage, setbacks, and height with no modifications. So in the end, it's my hope that our presentation was clear and that you appreciate the year of effort that we have taken to listen to our neighbors and work with the Single Family Design Review Board. I personally am looking forward to a romantic, beautiful addition to Santa Barbara's Southern Riviera. I also commend the SAN Board's patience and commitment to the design review process. We are proud of the result. It is our hope that you ratify the Single Family Design Board's approval and that you uphold the recent Planning Commission's approval as well. Thank you very much. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Please, Mark, why don't you stay up here? I think you know more about our house than we do. What I would like to focus on is the issue that Mr. Chatello continues to bring up, which is the access. And if I understand him right, he says that you need 20 feet, and doggone it, you only have 14 feet. I don't know how he comes up with the 14 feet, but if we could come up with the right-of-way to our home. And if you come across the shot of Green Ridge, looking up Green Ridge, perhaps that's the best way to orient it, and then go to that. Okay. This is looking up Green Ridge. On the right side, in the background, you see where it appears to narrow slightly right before the intersection with Mission Ridge Road. The right-of-way of Green Ridge is 20 feet wide. The reason why it narrows is that little area up there, the landscaping has encroached into the right-of-way. It happens to be the Denenholz property. We're all comfortable with it. The fire department has looked at it and said they're comfortable with it. But if it was felt that 20 feet needs to be 20 feet, in half an hour you could clear the miscellaneous bushes out of there and have 20 feet of easement. So this seems to be somewhat of a disingenuous issue to say the road is too narrow to access it. And I know we're running out of time. And I guess that would be sort of the final issue. The other one, if we have any time left, is...
You're at 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'll slow down a little bit.
There's a counter right there.
Oh, I see. Okay, very good. Thank you. It is the whole notion of the performance standard. And Mr. Zink made an interesting comment. He goes, so what are you going to do? You have this big lot, and you have an FAR that wants to restrict the square footage. And what does happen over and over again is these large estates over time become split and split and split till you're down to the minimum square footage of the zoning that you're in. There is enough square footage and probably the opportunity to split this lot. We don't want to do that. We think the lot is fabulous the way that it is. We want to preserve it that way. And so I think the performance standard, well, it seems to be a question here. The Single Family Design Board got it the first night. They said, it's like for like. You have this cottage, you're going to replace it here. We're replacing it from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom. We're not increasing the density. So with that, I'd really like you to look at this access issue and realize that there really is good access to this property. It's 300 feet long, it's straight, it's relatively flat. And thank you very much for your time. I know this has been a distraction to the many things you're involved in.
No, it's part of the job. Don't worry. So you're at 3 minutes and 31 seconds left?
We'll save that. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Any questions for the applicant? Okay, we'll move on to public comment. Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss.
I actually do have a question. How wide is the archway or whatever we call that?
I believe the portal is about 12 feet wide and about 10 feet high.
And is that, can fire engines access that?
Can you come to the mic, please?
We met
I'm
with Jim
asking him to
Austin
come
at
to the
length
mic.
about that, and they plan not to go through the portal. They will fight the fire from the hammerhead we've created in front of the portal, and they're absolutely okay with our architectural design.
I'll ask them about that then. Thank you.
Mr. House also has a question.
Just one of the questions that came up in some of the correspondence we received in advance of today's hearing challenged the size of the courtyard, the motor court, the circular area there, and talked about the concern that somehow it was designed larger than it might be necessary. And I'm wondering if you would want to respond to that. I'm just kind of curious as to the reason for the size of that, if there was any particular parameters that you were using to design
50
it.
feet, 50-foot turnaround is just a comfortable radius for any car turning a circle. It's not really that large. It's also not visible from any of the other properties, so I really don't see why it matters, actually.
Okay, it didn't have an effect on the bulk of the overall project in any way, as far as you're concerned?
None whatsoever.
Thank you.
Mr. Francisco also.
I wanted to ask a question of our fire department
Oh,
representative.
sure. You want to do that now or after public comment?
I think I'd like to do it before public
Sure,
comment.
why don't we do that right now? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Aye. I just wanted to get your overall assessment of the fire access issues on this site.
Okay, Mayor Schneider and Council Member Francisco, I'm Jim Austin, and I'd like to go on record, just in case the fire marshal is watching. I'm not the fire marshal. I'm the supervisor for the Fire Prevention Bureau, a.k.a. very junior fire marshal. With that being said, I've been the plan reviewer for our bureau for this particular project from its inception, so I'm fairly familiar with it. There's a number of things we do when we analyze a project such as this, almost a remodel, so to speak. And what we do is we look at what's existing on the property, and then we look at what's proposed, and we weigh those two, because as you've all seen up there, it's a very difficult area. But there's a number of things I looked at, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the fire department access. You know, Kelly, I could show that to her, or can you bring it up? One of the things, when I measure distance, it's via our hose length, and the engines have 150-foot quick attack lines on them. That's what that's based on. So wherever that engine can park, I need to be able to get 150 feet around the structure. So a couple of the properties, we actually can get our hose length around, even those properties take their vehicle or their personal access from Green Ridge. I can get access with our fire engines from Mission Ridge. There's also, and I don't have a pointer, but great, now I got to learn how to use it. This property right here, it takes access from both sides, so we can actually get to it down here. And although I had trouble deciphering, it appears that this property right here also has some access from High Ridge. So we take all those things into consideration. So with that being said, it's not truly 7 properties or structures that are taking access from a fire department standpoint or standard. And so I based it on that. I did go out and finally physically measure the 14-foot constriction, and it's truly the hedge sticks into the right-of-way for a ways, but the real pinch point is probably only about 18 inches, in my opinion. Some maintenance could be done on the hedges, but you know that's a maintenance issue that we deal with every year on an annual basis. So with that being said, it basically meets fire department access requirements, not to the letter of the law, but you know close. And so I've also had Engine 7 go out there and access the property and have the captain give me an assessment of what, you know, if a number of reasons for being up there, wildland, medical emergencies, which is most common, structure, fire, you know, things like that. And he felt comfortable with what was available to him. So I take that into consideration because we don't have a gridded, you know, by the standard type of city. So you got to include everybody in that. With that being said, the other things that we looked at, there's an existing, and please don't quote my terminology here because I know there's discrepancy with secondary units and accessory structures and whatever they're labeled. But there's one existing building that exceeds our current access standards. We couldn't lay a hose line to that structure on our primary attack line. So we would have to take the time, switch over to we have what we call an extended line that's 275 feet, but it's not pre-plumbed. It's sitting there, so we have to switch them out. We can't reach that. They're going to tear that structure down, and the new one's going to be located within our 150-foot length. And they designed it. There was a question about the arch. It was designed, basically, they pulled everything in so we could park at the front and bring our hose in that archway. I did ask them to take consideration in for the height for an ambulance. Because, again, that'll probably be the most likely reason we would be there. So I want to be able to get an ambulance through there and get it right up to a front door. That was taken into consideration. The other things that the house currently doesn't have that the new proposed structures will have is they will have fire sprinkler systems. The construction requirements will be current code, which is more fire resistant than what's available. Or what's currently there. Also, we're going to get a chance at the landscaping per today's code because they're going to redo the whole landscape, so it'll meet today's requirements. So when you weigh those against each other, the proposed is more fire safe. You know, Chief Oaks is right. I'm not going to argue that it isn't a dangerous area up there. You know, but that's existing. It's going to be there if it's not approved. If this gets approved, it's more, in our opinion, fire safe. I know that was a very detailed answer, but hopefully I hit everybody's.
Thank you.
That was the question, so you
Great.
answered it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, why don't we move on to public comment? I have 2 minutes at the podium for you. We have to start with Susan Petrovich, be followed by Laurel Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Susan Petrovich with the law firm of Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck. I came late to this process. I did not participate in any hearing on this project before today. So Mr. Chitillo's allegations would not apply. I did want to address the CEQA discussion. There are 2 additional exemptions that I think need to be honored and included. One is 15302, that is for replacement and reconstruction, because I agree with your fire official, this is essentially a replacement and a reconstruction, and also 15332, which is infill development. This is infill development. I think that it sounds like the access and fire issues have already been addressed. So I'm going to turn to something that hasn't been addressed at least not that I could tell as a member of the public. I'm not sure whether Mr. Chatillo submitted to you some proposed conditions or whether he intends to on rebuttal. But because he gave you a packet of information that wasn't shared with the public or with the Sanborns, I feel that I have to address these proposed conditions because I don't know whether you've received them or will. First, they were referred to as consensus conditions by Mr. Chatillo, but the Sanborns never agreed to these being included as conditions on their project. Many of these duplicate but take to an absurd extreme existing city requirements imposed on all new development. The Sanborns are entitled to equal treatment under the city's development requirements, no more and no less. Most of these proposed conditions are more rigorous than the city requires of other applicants and are inappropriate and overreaching. For instance, they propose a limitation on construction days that is substantially different from what other projects are subject to. Some of them are directly duplicative of the city's.
You need to wind up, please.
Okay, and then third, there are courtesies that the Sanborns have extended, but that are private courtesies between them and their neighbors pertaining to Greenridge Lane that are not within the city's purview because it's a private road. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Laurel Phillips will be Mr. House, actually Ms. Petrovich, if you can come back up. Mr. House has a question.
I want to be sure I'm looking at something that you are referring to. So what document are you referring to?
Well, I don't know
think we
what
have
you
anything
received.
that you're. I don't think we have that document here.
Well,
so.
then if it's presented to you on rebuttal, I would.
Okay,
That's what
so I thought you were referring to a
I
letter that we've
received something
received, and I
by
was looking for
email,
that.
and I didn't know whether it was in that packet, so I felt
Okay,
this
thank
was my only shot at addressing it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Laurel Phillips will be followed by Keith Rivera, and then the final speaker will be Beverly Johnson Trial.
Good afternoon. I think this is my third or fourth appearance in support of this project. My husband and I live uphill on High Ridge Lane. And I want to say that my first several appearances had to do with curiosity, as any uphill neighbor would have. I was very, very satisfied with the level of questioning and the scrutiny by your Planning Commission and by the Single Family Design Board members. I'm actually here today as an attorney in town who wants to make sure that you give full faith and credit to the people that you've employed and who absolutely have bent over to make very judicious decisions. Thank you.
Keith Rivera, followed by Beverly Johnson Trial, and then the final speaker will be Michael Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. During the design review process on this project, I represented the neighbors to the immediate south of the project, and they had some concerns regarding potential privacy impacts on their property. During that process, we had a series of meetings and discussions with the applicants. They were responsive, made a series of significant design changes, including moving the house back, eliminating a second floor deck, lowering the height, adding landscaping, that in turn mitigated any privacy issues that the neighbors had at this point. So personally, I think the project's well designed, and I think the applicants have been responsive to their neighbors and to the request of the Single Family Design Board. Thank you.
Beverly Johnson Trial. Good afternoon.
Hello. I have been voicing my concern about the overdevelopment of this site since the previous owners of 1233 first brought their proposal before the SFDB. The present proposal will have impacts on the immediate neighbors, in particular Mr. and Mrs. Wright and the entire city. I have for you show and tell, some pictures of the way it currently looks for the Wrights, who are the people, the elderly couple who are on the south. And I don't know who I can hand
Give it
this
to our clerk right here.
Yes. Here. This is taken from High Ridge Lane, which is a public street. If the project is approved, the Wrights will essentially lose their view in its entirety. While attending the various board meetings relating to this project, it has become obvious that There is a distinct need for private views to be protected. Also, the plan for Santa Barbara and the neighborhood preservation ordinance, while excellent, lack teeth. These are guidelines. This is very disturbing since the plan and the ordinance represent a great deal of thought and expense devoted to trying to protect our city. Santa Barbara has always been synonymous with paradise. Living in paradise, dining in paradise, polo in paradise, such a thought. And so please let us not become overdeveloped like Orange County. Let us keep our beloved Santa Barbara synonymous with paradise. Thank you.
Michael Cooper.
Madam Mayor and Council, I've lived on Mission Ridge for 15 years. I had a party, a wedding reception. Numerous people were there parking on the street. I'm adjacent to, as you know, Riviera's wonderful Franceschi Park. Ranger Ryan Lugo, Parks Department, issued 10 parking citations to guests. And as you can only imagine, I got a wee bit upset. So I went down and talked to Sergeant Olson. I also talked to Captain Allman of the police department, or fire department, about the tickets. And I found out that Mission Ridge is a non-conforming street, as Mark Chatillo has said. And the reality is, as you all know, the majority of streets in Santa Barbara are non-conforming. That's just the way this city is. And pressing Sergeant Olson about this issue and having a real thing up my, because of TCC, when I see cars parked on non-conforming streets, I'm going, wait a minute, I got 10 tickets that I paid for, by the way, for my guests. And Sergeant Olson was very clear about it. He says, we can't enforce this. It's just the way it is. And most of those cars that are parking on, pick almost any street you want to think of, anywhere that is outside of a grid pattern in this city, they have garages, but they're all for storage, not for cars. And it's a major issue. But you know what? We can't do anything about it. It's what is. And that's pretty much what Sergeant Olson said. So for Mark Chatillo to have this issue about our streets being non-conforming, not a lot you can do about it. And I just think that it's ridiculous. We participated in the Mission Canyon fire exercise, the emergency evacuation. I participated in the Riviera emergency evacuation. We've all been through the 2 fires. Everybody seemed to get out okay except for one lady, and I think it was the Painted Cave fire, which is number 3. But these little non-conforming streets do work in an emergency, and that was one of my big concerns when I got those 10 tickets. So it is what it is, but you know what? With this city working as well as it works, it worked. So I just want to put that to rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes public comment. On the appellant, you have a minute 9 if you'd like to use some of that. Or all of it.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to ask Don Oakes to summarize his comments, and then I'll wrap up with the remaining time.
Be
Yeah,
quick.
just quickly, based on my passion for safety in the fire in the WUI, in my professional opinion, this particular property is an area of extreme risk of life loss and injury from fire, and the proposed project significantly increases the risk. Thank you.
Thank you. And Madam Mayor, I just want to make the point that CEQA also imposes when there's a cumulative impact, it requires environmental review. And that's where we want to get. We tried to work with the landowners. It didn't work out. We think that you need to go through the environmental review process to give us the opportunity to have these issues come out and be fleshed. Yeah, nobody died during the Hezecita fire, but there was a couple of firefighters that got 2nd and 3rd degree burns. So I think that's emblematic of the kinds of issues that we need to grapple with here. You don't want to make a decision now that's going to exacerbate the fire risk for existing residents, for our firefighters, and for the residents that are coming behind. So we ask that you approve the appeal, you direct that there be environmental review if they want to pursue the performance standard permit, or you simply deny that permit and ensure that our streets are going to be as safe as they can be. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. The applicant, you have 3 minutes and 31 seconds if you'd like part of that or all of that.
Thank you. I don't think that I need it. Today is the 1-year anniversary of our first hearing with the Single Family Design Board. And I think you've seen that this plan has evolved in a very positive way. We hope that you like it. We hope that you will deny the appeal and allow this project to go forward. We really thank the staff and all of you for all your time, especially our neighbors coming down here, especially Max, who is still awake. And And thank you so much.
Great. Okay, it's to the council. Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the appellant has brought a large number of issues up here, and I'm only going to deal with a few of them. As far as Mr. Chitillo's request for environmental review is concerned, obviously he knows a lot more about CEQA than I do, but it did appear to me that this met the requirement for a categorical exemption in that it's the replacement of existing structures. And in terms of, is this a radical intensification of use? I simply don't see that. Yes, it's a larger house, and most people, when they replace houses that were built in the 40s in this town, build larger houses. That's reality. The point that was brought up about Professor Kova's study, that came up in the context of the Mission Canyon Association review of their situation, and admittedly, that's a perilous situation. I lived in Mission Canyon for a while and decided it was not a safe place to be. They have one exit route, and obviously, they have a real issue up there. The more houses that are added in Mission Canyon, the greater the burden you're putting on that one narrow exit route. That doesn't really apply here, in my view. I understand, the Riviera has a lot of complicated, narrow little streets, and that can be dangerous. It has been dangerous just in the recent fire. But as Dr. Cooper pointed out, that's the reality of the Riviera. It appeared to me when we were at the site yesterday that the major impact on views for the neighbors is trees, not this structure. And I realize that in terms of the Wrights view, because the Wrights property is immediately to the north, their view will be impacted. There's absolutely no question about that, and that's too bad. I'm sure that's an unhappy fact for them. But the reality of the zoning ordinance is that we do not have an ordinance that says private views must be protected. If you build a structure that conforms to the zoning ordinance and whatever the applicable guidelines are for the area, you're within your rights to do that, even if it does have a detrimental effect on a neighbor's view. That's just the reality of how our laws are written, and what we're up here to do in these cases is to interpret those laws. I think that one of the most important issues, obviously, is fire safety. And given that we have an opinion, and let me say I have the utmost respect for Mr. Oaks's experience and knowledge, and again, there's no question that there are inherent fire safety problems with the entire Riviera. That's just the reality of that place. At the same time, I have to listen to our own staff when they analyze the situation up there. There's no easy, straightforward ABC way of looking at this. You have to look at each situation individually. And it doesn't appear to me that this situation, actually right down the hill from there on Arbolado Road, there are, in my view, much worse fire safety issues just a block away. In terms of the overall size and scale of the design, I think that we often hear about people bringing in big projects and then cutting them down as a tactic. I think what happened here was, whatever the circumstances were, the final design is a design that, at least to me, appears to conform to Santa Barbara's Mission Revival architectural style pretty much to the letter. And obviously that was a collaboration between the applicant's architect and the Single Family Design Board. I think the results are harmonious with the neighborhood. Indeed, to me, it seemed more harmonious than some of the other houses in the immediate neighborhood. And in terms of the actual scale of the house in relation to the lot, I don't know the address, but there was a house on the corner of Green Ridge and Mission Ridge that appeared to be quite a bit larger in relation to its lot. So in sum, I think that this project is consistent with the architectural style in the area to the extent that there is an architectural style. It's not out of scale. It does have an impact on some of the neighbors' views, and that's unfortunate, but that's reality. There's nothing illegal about that. And I think that the fire safety and the CEQA issues, as far as I can tell, just aren't there. At least they're no different and in some ways better than similar situations on adjoining properties. So in my view, I would deny this appeal and uphold the decision of the Planning Commission and the Single Family Design Board.
Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I agree with Mr. Francisco's assessment. I think that that there is a trade-off of trying to evaluate the fire safety of one project as opposed to the other, and there's in these quirky situations, it's impossible to sort of do that in a like-for-like basis. So I think we're close, and I do take staff's analysis and accept it. Obviously, I asked the questions early about floor area ratio because that is a concern of mine, and I wanted to at least make sure that we are consistent as we use this metric going forward. The property has potential to be a lot split. Everybody knows that getting a lot split is different than actually having the square footage for it, but it's a remarkably flat piece of property with some access issues, and I know that would be the issue that would probably be looked at most carefully with a lot split. The main dwelling is 3,750 square feet, thereabouts. That feels reasonable to me. And I don't know whether the appellant was present during the various SFDB processes. Was the appellant was involved in that? I would go back to then even the Valle Verde project that we looked at a while back, where the appellant's activities and advocacy was very useful in trimming this project down to a smaller scale. And I think that the applicant's feet were held to the fire, so to speak, and that project is much more view compatible than the original one. I think that the reduction in that ridge line, the ridge of the house, gives some views that were not there with the original proposal. So I think that an area where, and maybe this would be where some of Mr. Chitillo's proposed conditions would go to, is that we certainly don't want to see landscaping getting up into people's views out of this project, that there would be trees that would grow up and then block more views. And so that would be something that I'd be concerned about and want to make sure that that future, it may be that the landscape plan is such that it's already precluding that, but I at least would like that to be part of what comes out of this discussion today, is that the loss of views that is occurring with this proposal would not include any more vegetation that would be growing up into the view shed of neighbors to the north. So I would be able to support this project going forward, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Question, Mr. Chitillo, if you could. How far is the Denenholz property from, let's say, the gate? Well, not the gate, but the archway, sorry.
Madam Mayor, the archway to the property?
Yeah.
The project that's being proposed, probably 300 feet, 250. I'm sorry, which part of the property of the Denenholz's property?
Yeah, the Denenholz property from, well, you could say
the nearest
balcony.
The nearest portion of their property to
the
the
gate?
gate?
Balcony. Have you ever measured
Well,
that?
the property corner, I've not measured the property corner. I would estimate it at probably 75 feet.
Say it again?
The property corner, from the Denenholz's property to the corner of their parcel closest to the gate, portal, 75 feet, and probably 120 feet
balcony
to the house, to the nearest part of the
Is this their
the
primary?
deck.
Is this their primary residence?
It is not.
Not. Okay. So they're there part of the year. But
I
don't know.
I don't know.
Okay,
No, but
that's fine. I understand.
Thank you. Is that,
That's all. Thanks
Okay.
very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Let me
Chatilla.
continue if I could. Well, I think one of the points that was made at some point was that this was going to denigrate the neighborhood somehow, and I frankly don't see that. I think it's an incredible addition to the Riviera. I wish it were mine. I see minimal impact on the appellant's house, more impact, although not terrible, but not great, on the house immediately adjacent. I do think that it's important that we play by the rules and not change them. And these folks have sort of bent over backwards over and over again, and it's almost like others won't take yes for an answer, so they keep coming back. So I will support denying the appeal and hope that this house is built soon. I'd love to see it in actuality.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I'm pretty impressed by Mr. Chatillo's case being made here in terms of all the details. I don't think there's a lot of rocks that were not overturned to look for what we could do, but I do believe that categorically most of the technical arguments were addressed by the applicant, and I think successfully so. I also appreciate how respondent the applicant was to the neighbors. I have a neighbor that I wish would have acted in the same way, if you're listening out there.
He is now.
Yeah. And I do believe, having seen the number of iterations that design went through over the period of time and the work of the Single Family Design Review Board, that the applicant put in significant amounts of consideration and clearly money to try to be a part of this neighborhood and try to preserve views which frankly weren't even their responsibility to preserve. I think they went out of their way to be good neighbors and to be a part of this neighborhood. Plus, with the architectural style, it is clearly a Riviera appropriate structure. So I really could not find a good reason to not support this project, so I will be supporting it going forward.
Ms. Self?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm usually real critical about the necessity to stick to rules, but there's obviously some flexibility allowed to make reasonable adjustments. And I think the adjustments are very reasonable because you just can't always have a cookie cutter approach to everything. I agree with everything that's being said so far, so I'm not going to really go to that. But I think that, the Sanborns have made a very good faith effort, and to me that means a lot, is that you're trying to get along, you're trying to cooperate, and, I think I was really compelled in the appeal about the fire department, but then hearing our own fire department come up and explain the access and how it's measured, and I think that should put a lot of people's minds at rest. And because it seems like if this appeal was upheld, that you couldn't build anything anywhere for any reason. And that's just not fair. You should have certain property rights, and it looks like a beautiful structure, and I would think denying the appeal would be the fair thing to do for everybody concerned.
Mr. House?
I tend to agree with the speakers so far here from the council, and I do want to first of all acknowledge and appreciate the appellant for their active engagement with this and really making sure that they've done their due diligence and followed through on this, because the changes that have happened to the project in the process have truly made it a better project. It's significantly improved over what it had been in the beginning, and had it come to us in one of its previous iterations, I wouldn't be able to be supportive of it today. So I think that's an important part of this process, that engagement at that level. And Mr. Chatilla, you make really compelling cases, and one question I have for I think for Mr. Wiley, or our environmental analyst, and it's a kind of important one with regards to the CEQA process. At least in my training about CEQA, it came as a surprise to me at some point that one of the triggers for moving from categorical exemption to some form of focused EIR is our disputing experts. And we've heard testimony today from our own expert, if you will, from our fire department and fire marshal's office, and then we've heard a very clear and unambiguous statement from someone else who appears to be recognized as an expert that they disagree strongly with ours. Is there an automatic or necessary trigger for focused EIR with regard, or something like that, per the CEQA process, because of those debating points of view?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember House, the short answer is no, but let me just clarify something. The next step, if a project, a discretionary project subject to CEQA, is not statutorily exempt or categorically exempt, isn't necessarily an EIR. It would be, first, there would be something called an initial study prepared, and that initial study is essentially this checklist approach of environmental issues to determine if there's any potentially significant adverse impacts, and if there are any potentially significant adverse impacts identified, then there would typically be either an EIR, some form of an EIR, or possibly a mitigated negative deck. That mitigated negative declaration is somewhat of the applicant's call, because it involves pre-mitigating a project. So the distinction here, I think, is maybe a categorical exemption versus a negative declaration.
I see.
Just a straight-out negative declaration. But more specifically, I was sitting here thinking about this, because we get this a lot, trying to think of an analogy to how you analyze this. And I think maybe a rough analogy is looking at something under a microscope versus looking at something under a normal camera lens, versus looking at something under a wide-angle lens, and just standing back and looking at something. By that I mean there's a tendency in CEQA, if you're saying there's something significant here and it's an adverse impact, to isolate on a particular project. In this case, isolate on this property and say that fire access issues are quote-unquote significant. But in fact, CEQA's much bigger picture. It's a much larger analysis. It's a neighborhood analysis, maybe even a regional analysis. But let me just finish. The real point here is it's your call to decide what's a potentially significant impact. Now, CEQA is real clear. One of the key things, and you have to have substantial evidence, and they actually define substantial evidence for making that call. And one of the key ways they define substantial evidence is expert testimony. And frankly, and I doubt Mr. Chatilla would deny this, it's good lawyering, you bring in an expert. That's why the retired fire marshal was here. He was their expert. But in fact, as you point out, the city had an expert. And I thought Mr. Austin's response was quite comprehensive, and in fact his work on this was so. And I think your specific question is there something that says that disagreement among experts requires something other than a categorical exemption? And my answer is no, because not necessarily, because it's your call to determine significance. And again, I think that gets back to whether you look at this in a macro sense or you just isolate on whether it's this property or Green Ridge Lane.
Okay.
And let me, one final point, because I think aesthetics and neighborhood impacts were asserted as a possible environmental impact. I will tell you that the city staff and the city attorney's office feels very strongly that that sort of thing does not apply in Santa Barbara 99 times out of 100. By that I mean aesthetic impacts, size, bulk, and scale impacts, generally by our process, our design review process, the whole year-and-a-half process here or whatever it might be, does not result in potentially significant aesthetic impacts, except, again, in a very large sense, a two-block development of 400,000 square feet, or that could have an environmental impact.
That aesthetic impacts, you meant environmentally significant aesthetic
because aesthetic impacts or size, bulk, and scale impacts can translate into environmental impacts. You know, building a glass and steel building in a rural setting would be an environmental impact, particularly a pristine rural setting, that sort of thing. But by and large, the city design review process pre-mitigates to a level of less than significance by its nature.
I see. Thank you for the very clear and comprehensive answer. I don't see that this has risen to the level of significance the way you're describing. I was not just intrigued, I was concerned about the narrowness in at least one point of the lane, the private lane. I'm certain that if it really is a matter of trimming the hedges back so that they have the clearance stays the full width all the way through, I would rather expect that even the applicant would be willing to cover the cost of the landscape or of somebody coming out and trimming that back, but it just would need to have the permission, I suppose, of the neighbor to do that. So those are things, I don't even know if that's necessary. So I just that was the only thing really there that concerned me, and I appreciated the idea, the getting ahead of the issue with Mr. White's suggestion about landscaping. The landscaping plan should very well be designed so that it does not put trees in the view that's just been retained by the architecture. So I will be supporting the applicant on this project.
My comments, I don't want to repeat all that's been said. I do have just a little additions. The concerns about fire access and safety and evacuation and protection of structures, I think if the secondary unit was flipped, if it was where it was proposed to be now and it was going to be proposed to be where it is currently, I agree a lot more with the appellant's comments on that. But I think the relocation of that secondary unit actually, and we heard that from our own department, creates a safer environment in terms of fire safety there. So that, to me, I think was important to say. I also think it's important to note that there were no modifications being asked out of all this. It is a large building and house, but it's not asking for any setback mods or anything like that, and I think that's something to acknowledge as well. And pretty much I just tend to agree with the rest of the comments up here. The hedge trimming at someone else's site really should be the responsibility of that particular property owner. I would not want to enforce that or put that as a condition of approval for this particular project. And hopefully, as good neighbors, if we all care about fire safety and circulation around the area, then we can work together to make that happen without some official condition of approval. So, Mr. White.
Madam Mayor, I'd be willing to make a motion if the time has come. Go ahead. Okay, I would move that the council deny the appeal of the office of Mark Chitillo and uphold the decisions of the Single Family Design Board and the Planning Commission. And also, I would ask that a condition be added that the landscaping be designed and maintained such that it does not, it will not adversely affect views of neighbors.
Is there a second?
There is, if we could add that the access that we were talking about, the hedge at the head of the lane also be trimmed.
Well, I honestly think that
Different
we should
property.
keep that separate from this
Okay, fine.
project.
I'll second then as is.
So, okay, anything else to the motion? Okay, all those in favor? Stop. Yep, Mr. Wiley.
I'm sorry, I have to point out a concern with the condition about the landscaping.
Okay.
And it has to do with the responsibilities of city staff and city attorney's office. When you have a condition like that designed and maintained to not adversely impact the views,
Pretty vague.
you put us right in the middle of the private view issue. And in theory, and this is not far-fetched, that if we don't avoid this sort of thing in the future, we will have a neighbor come to the city and say, look at that condition, you must enforce it. Force them to trim their tree down, and then staff can't get to do it. And it gets referred to the city attorney's office. They won't do it. City attorney's office has to file a lawsuit. I think that's too much. We've had this discussion. It's been a while. I would suggest that there is an approved landscaping plan and that possibly we ask the SFDB in the final review of that plan to assure that the species of the trees that are used and the locations of the trees are such that they should not, by their nature, impact the neighbor's views, and leave it at that.
Okay. That's fine. And that would hold going forward, let's say 30 years from now when everything is fully grown, and somebody decides they're going to plant a redwood tree instead of a ground cover, that would violate the conditions of that landscape plan?
Yeah, a few years ago, we revised our code to require that once you've got an approved landscaping plan, you can't change it without going back to the original.
Okay.
We might want to be clear that in any additional trees that aren't, that would need to be also reviewed by, I guess, the single-family design board for landscape approval.
Okay. All right. Then that would
You want to amend your motion then?
Yes, I would amend my motion accordingly.
Take back our words.
You got that, Cindy? Mr. Francisco, did you have something?
Yes, I did. I agree with Mr. Wiley. I also think that the intent of the original motion is really covered, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Wiley, by our view dispute ordinance. It is designed to do just that. And I think that I don't see a problem with adding this condition on the Single Family Design Board review process, but I do know that realistically there's no way that this is going to control somebody 20 years from now.
I hear you. And at the same time, if there's I use the an egregious example, where if there's something that really is in their face, they would have something to work with decades from now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we all know what the motion is. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that passes. Thank you very much. And any council member committee assignment reports? Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This morning, the Sustainability Committee met, and
If you could, I'm sorry, we still have a meeting going on, so if you want to speak, please do so outside the chambers. Thank you. Mr. White?
Thank you. Anyway, the committee discussed primarily the environmental program grants that are now the city is now managing, dealing with energy efficiency, water conservation, and the like, as well as more issues dealing with recyclables, their cost, and how it affects our rates and our system.
And that item will be coming to the council.
Back to council.
Yeah. Any other council member committee assignment reports? Okay, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.